Zhou Yuan used to be an ordinary clerk. When he was offered an internship in another company, he was overjoyed. Unfortunately, everyone had their way with him. Some wanted a cup of coffee. Others forced the young man to type a document. All day long, the guy carried huge piles of documents from office to office, but no one thought to teach him the wisdom of work. On one such day, Zhou Yuan was in the kitchen near the coffee machine. The kitchen was empty. The whole office was doing its own thing. Filling another glass, the young man thought with sadness that he had been serving the staff for the past day. At this moment, Su Ro-chin came into the kitchen. The green-eyed girl took his coffee and said that he needed to learn how to say no to employees sometimes. They had known each other since university. Ever since then, Zhou Yuan had been looking at her with such loving eyes. As he stared at Ro-chin, the young man didn't keep his eyes on the glass. The coffee poured over the top and burned his hand badly. Due to the intense pain, Zhou Yuan let the glass out of his hands, and all of its contents spilled onto his pants. The girl offered to wipe up the stain. The young man sat down on the chair and blushed even more. Ro-chin said that there was no need to be shy. They were not strangers after all. The girl had to kneel down herself to wipe the stain a little above her knee. She blushed, embarrassed by her own embarrassment. Meanwhile, the manager came into the kitchen. He was unhappy that Zhou Yuan was lounging around. He needed to distribute gifts to the staff. The young man tried to object that it was not his responsibility. The man got angry and shouted that the boy should familiarize himself with all the departments. Ro-chin asked if they could go together. The manager replied that she had better prepare materials for the meeting. The girl winked goodbye to Zhou Yuan and whispered in his ear that they would definitely go together next time. The man saw that Ro-chin was being too nice to the trainee and angrily hit the guy in the face with the gift bag. The paper bag fell to the floor. Neat silver paper wrapped in gold ribbons spilled out of it. Zhou Yuan was angry, but the manager didn't let him say a word. He demanded that all the gifts be collected and distributed to the departments. The man smirked as he watched the boy meekly picking up the bags. He knew that the young man had nothing more to look forward to in life. Zhou Yuan was more than a little angry. If he didn't need this job, he would show that Ling Shun that he shouldn't be bullied. Suddenly, the young man's cell phone vibrated in his pants pocket. It distracted him from his negative thoughts. At a glance, this message looked like a regular spam and offered to go higher, guaranteeing a secured life. Zhou Yuan looked incredulously at the image of the medieval warrior on the screen. He decided that he would come back to it later. Suddenly, the warrior's avatar became three-dimensional. The young man was horrified to feel himself being sucked inside the phone. At the same time, a golden-colored portal appeared right out of thin air in one of the unremarkable nooks and crannies of the city. Zhou Yuan fell out of it, hitting the ground painfully. One of the gifts was lying nearby. The young man couldn't figure out what this place was. Suddenly there was a strange, uneven howl from behind him. The boy turned around fearfully, hoping he'd just heard it. There were dozens of hands reaching for the young man from behind the iron fence. These creatures looked more like zombies than human beings. It was only now that Zhou Yuan realized what he was up against and doomedly fell to his knees. He couldn't understand how he had gotten to this place in the first place. A system menu appeared in front of the young man. Thanks to the information, he learned that he could travel between worlds. The boy's eyes lit up greedily. He greedily reached for the information board. The world shone with new colors. Suddenly, one of the fence sections collapsed to the ground. Several zombies managed to destroy a section of the fence. Zhou Yuan almost turned gray with fear and rushed out. For the first time in his life, the young man realized that his life directly depended on his speed. Feeling free, the crowd of zombies began to chase him. The roar of their voices made him panic even more. The guy had the advantage. The zombies moved much slower and could not catch up with him. After a few minutes, the young man was already tired. Starting to gasp for breath, Zhou Yuan continued to run, slightly slowing down his pace. The guy cried out for help to the whole neighborhood, hoping that he would be heard. Suddenly, a fragmentation grenade with the pin pulled flew from the roof of a nearby house toward the crowd of zombies. Throwing another grenade, a fair-haired girl with a militant look jumped down from the roof. She shouted for the young man to hide. Lin Shun expertly landed and ran onward. She was already used to doing this kind of operation. The zombies were blown apart by the huge explosion. The girl took out a Chupa Chupa and didn't even turn around. Zhou Yuan thanked the girl, who by then had sent a caramel into her mouth. It turned out that she was hunting zombies. The young man admitted he couldn't thank her enough, so he simply handed the huntress a box of yuebin. The girl didn't know what it was, so she sniffed it carefully. It didn't seem dangerous, so the aborigine dared to chew a little. Barely taking a bite out of the yuebin, the girl enthusiastically awed. Zhou Yuan smiled. The guy saw that she hadn't gotten to the filling yet. The stranger closed her eyes in pleasure and embarrassedly exclaimed that the food was delicious. The young man thought she was pretending. To his surprise, the girl handed him a small bar of gold and stated that it was payment for yueben. She couldn't eat it for free. After licking the caramel on a stick, the warrior woman smiled and said that the price should be put higher. Zhou Yuan asked what her name was. The beauty quickly turned around and stared intently with blue eyes, which the young man immediately fell in love with. It turned out that her name was Lin Shun. The lad quickly settled in and came to a market where vendors offered various weapons and potatoes for recuperation. Zhou Yuan laid out 6 kinds of cakes nearby and loudly started calling out to passers-by, offering to buy ancient yuebing. There were those who wanted it right away. One of them remembered that his grandfather used to talk about such food. The other asked how much the treat was sold for. The young man smiled and immediately replied that 1 gram of the ancient and healing product was equivalent to 1 gram of gold. The buyers grumbled unhappily. One of them shouted that no one would buy a piece of yueben at that price. Zhou Yuan stood his ground. He explained that life is only given once. Tomorrow each of them would regret not having tasted the cake. A bearded man approached him. He handed the young man 50 grams of gold and asked for half of the ancient delicacy. The other buyers envied the mercenary for being so rich and being able to afford to fiddle with money. Unlike the others, the man knew perfectly well the value of the yueben he had bought. He felt like he was in paradise. The gold he had spent was worth it. The mercenary quickly appreciated the magnificence of the cake and held out another 100-gram gold bar to the vendor. He asked for 2 halves in different flavors. Immediately after him, other customers came running. They demanded to have a small piece of yueben cut off for them. After spending some gold, all 3 customers enjoyed the immaculate ancient pastries. They had never tasted anything better. Evening came. The rows of merchants thinned out. By now, Zhou Yuan had managed to sell some yueben and was satisfied. In just a few hours, his pouch was filled with almost 600 grams of gold. The ringing of the coins delighted the young man's ears. He quickly calculated that in a few months of such trading, he would receive a sum for which he would have had to work for 3 years. Suddenly, a sharp knife was thrust under the boy's ribs. The smile on his face immediately faded. A hoarse voice told him not to move. The hooded stranger smirked gloatingly and told the frightened young man that Lao Zi had been interested in him for a long time. Zhou Yuan was dumbfounded with fear. Unfortunately, the bandit wouldn't just let go. He would have to give him his hard-earned gold. The man seemed to read his thoughts. He exclaimed that nothing could save the young man. No one was going to let him live. The system menu offered to return to his world. The guy immediately squealed that he wanted to go back, the blade almost touching his face. In the same second, a golden portal appeared in front of the young man and he jumped into it. The disgruntled mercenary tried to hold him back. To his surprise, the incomprehensible yellow circle disappeared, and with it, his victim. The man looked around, but the boy was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, Zhou Yuan found himself in his own apartment. The portal threw him in front of a large television. The young man fell exhaustedly on his knees in front of the sofa and laid his head on it tiredly. He was very close to death today. Everything was going well. He could only enter the world of the apocalypse in 12 hours. In that time, he would prepare a batch of yueben. The next morning started at the office as usual. Lin Shun only saw him as an errand boy. He angrily reminded the young man that yesterday he had asked him to distribute the gifts, but the guy wasn't even going to follow his superior's orders. Zhou Yuan frowned, saying that he came to this company to further develop his skills and did not have to do the job of a courier. Hearing a familiar voice, the director approached the young man and demanded to make him coffee. The boy refused him too, referring to his own business. The man was surprised and asked the manager how he was still in his position, if not even the trainees listened to him. Lin Shun offered to give the young man some more time. He promised the principal that the situation would change soon. Su Ruoqin was happy to see such a change in the guy. She asked since when did Zhou Yuan become so cocky. He smiled embarrassedly and said it was primarily her own merit. He must be independent in all things. Zhou Yuan discreetly looked at his watch. 12 hours of recharging had almost passed. It was almost time to start traveling. Since the young man had not set coordinates, the system chose an arbitrary location and dumped him on a flat area with a view of the mountains. This time the guy prepared a little better and cooked a whole backpack of beef with the goal of making good money. Suddenly someone clapped him on the shoulder. He was glad he could ask someone what this place was. When Zhou Yuan turned back, he was stunned. It was the same. He had managed to find a zombie among the mountains and had to flee. Besides, now there was a heavy backpack on his shoulders. The guy realized that he wouldn't be able to run with it for long. The food would have to be thrown away. The young man was breathing heavily. There was no other way out. He opened one of the canned goods as he walked, trying to distract his pursuers. Seeing that the maneuver worked, Zhou Yuan opened one pack after another and hurled it at the enemies until they fell behind. The canned beef was quite satisfying for the monsters, and they greedily devoured the canned beef, fighting over large chunks with each other. The young man was tired of running all the time and sat down to take a little break at the foot of the cliff. He had lost half of his supplies, and it was a considerable loss. To his surprise, the uneven hum of zombie voices was heard again in the distance. They were reaching for him again with their gnarled fingers. Zhou Yuan smirked. He realized that the canned zombies were not full of canned food, so he would still have to take the fight to them. Using the system menu, the guy learned that he could trade his accumulated gold for basic combat skills. The young man didn't hesitate for a moment. The skill of fighting was needed now, and he would still be able to get gold more than once. The monsters were coming closer and closer. The advantage was on their side, and they knew it well. One of the zombies roared and lunged to attack. He was unable to grab his victim. Zhou Yuan twisted around and kicked him in the stomach with his foot. His opponent started to settle on the ground. Encouraged by his first victory, the young man adopted a fighting stance and shouted that he would avenge them all for the lost money. To be sure, the guy hit the zombie between the eyes with his fist. The blow was so strong that the monster fell down, unconscious. Without slowing down, the young man killed 2 more inhabitants of the other world who were nearby. Zhou Yuan was very tired after the dynamic battle and was breathing heavily. However, with the help of the system, he single-handedly killed 3 zombies. A large, snow-white pickup truck pulled up to the place of the fight. The driver got out of the car and praised the young man sincerely. He and his partner saw what was going on, and even wanted to intervene in the unequal fight, but the guy handled it himself. Zhou Yuan asked the strangers who they were. The man in overalls proudly said that they were hunters. A strange growing rumble was heard in the distance. The man shouted that another group of monsters was coming straight for them. He started the engine and asked the young man to hurry up. They didn't have time to chat. The boy didn't need to be told twice. Having some experience with zombies, the young man took long leaps to cover the distance to the pickup truck. The car moved from its spot just in time. The zombies were already a few meters away from its rear bumper. The man in the back handed Zhou Yuan an assault rifle. He expressed his hope that the guy knows how to shoot. Bullets are expensive. While the young man mumbled a reply, the hunter took down the 3 fastest foes with single shots with bullets to the forehead. Zhou Yuan realized that in this world, marksmanship was very important for survival. Unfortunately, he didn't know how to shoot. The driver cheered him on through the back window and yelled that the zombies wouldn't disappear on their own. You had to shoot at them. A young man is faced with a dilemma. In his home world, the unauthorized use of weapons could land him in jail. The conclusion was self-evident. For 100 points, the system had acquired a basic mastery of weapons. Zhou Yuan grabbed his assault rifle and took aim at the nearest enemy. All of his actions had been brought to automaticity. The young man was killing the zombies running after the pickup truck as accurately as his partner, who had been doing it for a long time. But there was one very strange monster that bullets just bounced off of. It also moved faster than the others. Zhou Yuan asked what kind of creature it was. It turned out to be a level 2 zombie, more survivable and much more dangerous. The black monster was able to catch up with the car. It became clear to both guys that everything would be decided in the next few minutes. The huge zombie grabbed the hunter by the throat and pulled him out of the pickup. The guy almost suffocated. The monster had an iron grip. The monster threw the young man to the ground. Large layers of earth flew in different directions. The hunter realized that he was finished. The monster would not calm down. He could see that the shooter was still alive and he intended to strangle him. Zhou Yuan felt a surge of strength. He was now ready to fight and ran at the large zombie with his weapon drawn. The monster clearly didn't expect such resistance and fell to the ground, taking a knee to the head. His eyes lit up with hatred with fiery fires. But the advantage was lost, the barrel of the rifle sticking out of his mouth. The young man angrily asked if the zombie was hungry and offered it a taste of some lead. A shot rang out, and the monster was finished. The driver approached the guy, dragging the wounded hunter on his back. He said admiringly that he had underestimated him a little. Zhou Yuan exclaimed that the guys had also saved his life after all, so he couldn't leave them to their fate. The rescued young man knelt down beside the slain monster and dug into its innards a bit. He took out a blue crystal and explained that there are crystals of different colors present in zombies. Such a crystal is very expensive. Without a moment's hesitation, the hunter handed the boy the crystal and declared that he had earned his right to possess it. Zhou Yuan incredulously inquired if he was really allowed to take this expensive item for himself. The young man replied that the guy had killed the monster himself, so the crystal was his by right. The driver clapped his partner on the shoulder and added that no crystal was worth his brother's life. He slipped his hand into his pocket and pulled out a handful of white crystals. They were cheaper, but even they were enough for ammunition. Zhou Yuan thought about the crystal mining system and the different price of the stones. He realized that it was much more profitable to be a hunter in this world. The driver clapped the young man on the shoulder in a friendly manner, breaking him from his thoughts. The boy flinched in surprise. The man invited the frightened Zhou Yuan to join them. He makes a good hunter. Since the guy himself didn't know what he wanted yet, his new friends offered to give him a ride to the nearest village. The pickup slowly trotted off, leaving deep tread marks in the loose soil of the mountain valley. The young man looked at the blue crystal. He suspected that there was some energy concentrated inside. Meanwhile, the system was turned on. It turned out that the crystals falling from the bodies of monsters could also be exchanged for experience points. Zhou Yuan confirmed the exchange. The blue crystal began to melt in the air and moved piece by piece into the transparent screen. The system awarded 100 points. The young man could not believe that such a small crystal contained 100 grams of gold. In addition, the program detected that the wearer was carrying a lot of items and offered to exchange 100 points for 1 square meter of space. It was quite a lucky find. The spatial backpack would really come in handy now. The gold was already pulling the pockets away. The driver stopped the pickup truck and explained the way to the new acquaintance. The way to the village was through a refugee camp. The place was a dismal sight. Most of the people lived in tents. Some had adapted trailers for shelter. Everywhere on the roadside there were ragged people starving to death. They were even willing to trade their bodies for food. Suddenly, Zhou Yuan heard some girls' pleas and turned around with interest. He felt sorry for all these people. A little farther down the road, a girl in a blue dress ran out to meet a red car traveling in front of them. With tears in her eyes, she begged to share some food with her as she was already starving to death. A point-blank shot cut short the little girl's suffering. The eyes full of anguish easily read the incomprehension of such cruelty. Smoke was still coming from the gun held by the passenger of the red pickup truck. He shouted that no one dared to dirty Lao Zi's car. Zhou Yuan turned black with anger and was about to jump out of the car to teach those rascals a lesson for killing the girl. The hunter placed a hand on his shoulder imperiously and urged him to calm down and only attack if he felt his strength. The young man looked at the body of the innocent girl who lay in a pool of her own blood. He agreed that he had to become stronger. There were guards at the entrance to the settlement. The hunter explained that everyone had to carry a pass. Captain Osen got out of the vehicle and showed his documents. The guard asked if he had shot a lot today. The man turned around and pointed at Zhou Yuan. He asked for a pass for this kid, the young man along with them. The settlement was quite large and was protected by a double perimeter defense with watchtowers. The young man thanked the captain for the pass. The man smiled and wished them luck. Their base was elsewhere. Zhou Yuan waved happily at the pickup truck. The hunter pulled himself up and waved back at the young man in a friendly manner. As the car disappeared over the horizon, the guy retrieved a single can of beef from his backpack. It was time to make some money. He hoped the bag of canned beef should turn into at least 1 pot of gold. There was a rush at the market today. People were selling absolutely everything. One kid was offering a big Jeep at a 70% discount. The young man in the white shirt flatly refused to sell the rarest alcohol of the pre-nuclear era for 3 blue crystals. Zhou Yuan watched the auction with interest. He realized that absolutely any kind of goods could be bought and sold here. Suddenly, a large man appeared in front of the young man and asked him to stay for a moment. The boy didn't like it right away. The man pulled out an assault rifle and smirked. He stated that his interlocutor looked rather rich. Zhou Yuan asked in surprise how he could rob in broad daylight with a gun. It turned out to be an arms dealer. The young man was shaking with fear. He wondered what the weapon could have to do with his humble person. The boy wanted to leave quickly. The salesman said he had seen him in town with hunters. He pointed eloquently to the gun counter, offering to take something. Zhou Yuan looked at the machine gun in surprise and asked if the man was afraid to sell guns. The merchant laughed. Everyone should have a gun. He offered to give the assault rifle for only 5 blue crystals. For the sake of familiarity, the young man would get a 20% discount. To the seller's dismay, it turned out that the guy had neither blue crystals nor gold. The bidding was meaningless. The man angrily asked to give at least 200 potatoes for the rifle. Zhou Yuan said guiltily that he didn't have any potatoes. The merchant waved his hand dismissively, sending him away. He demanded that he not hang around and interfere with Lao Zi's business. The young man retrieved a can of beef and declared that you shouldn't value people based on appearances. He had things more valuable than crystals. The man exclaimed that this was where the conversation should have started. The guy smiled and brought the canned food closer, slipping his finger into the key ring on the tin. Zhou Yuan opened the lid with a quick movement and showed the merchant the contents. The man couldn't resist the strong odor. He offered to give up any of his weapons for 5 packs. The young man was satisfied with such a bargain. They shook hands firmly. The seller was also very happy that he'd gotten a valuable product. The guy asked where he could buy ammunition for his weapon. It turned out that ammunition could only be sold at an official warehouse. Zhou Yun wasn't the only one here. The girl behind the counter had a solid line of people lining up to replenish their ammunition. The young man showed the pretty saleswoman his weapon and asked if there was any ammunition for it. It turned out that you could get 10 bullets for a gram of gold. The boy was surprised. He had not realized that ammunition for firearms was sold at such an expensive price. The blue-eyed beauty replied with a bored look that 1 bullet could save his life. Of course, he might not buy them. Zhou Yuan took out a massive gold bar and boastfully asked how much ammunition he would be able to acquire in exchange for it. The saleswoman immediately smiled and instantly brought out 3 small wooden boxes of ammunition. The girl embarrassedly retrieved a business card from the hollow of her breast and offered to contact her. She would sell any amount of ammunition. The young man looked at the business card in confusion. He realized that in this world, money could buy absolutely everything. Zhou Yuan came home and dumped all the goodies on the table. The submachine guns and automatic rifles could barely fit on his table. The young man looked critically at his rudimentary arsenal. It's enough for the first time, but we'll have to expand the business a bit. Suddenly the boy heard a demanding knock on the door. He didn't know who it could be, and his eyebrows rose up in surprise. Zhou Yuan rushed to the table. He didn't know where to hide so many weapons at once, and he frantically looked around. A very familiar female voice was heard outside the door. Su Ruoqin shouted from behind the door that she was the one who had come to visit him. Zhou Yuan began to frantically hide his weapons and ammunition. He asked the girl to wait outside the door for a while. No matter how hard the young man tried, still the weapon samples were treacherously peeking out from behind his sinuses. There was absolutely nowhere to hide them. The only place to put the weapon was the small space under the bed. Shoving his gun and ammunition away, the boy rushed to the door and let his acquaintance in. The girl waited patiently for him. Zhou Yuan asked why she came to his house. Ruoqin replied that she had cooked more food than necessary and brought it to him. She smiled and asked why the young man had taken so long to open the door. She smiled and asked why it had taken him so long to open the door. Taking the food from the girl, Zhou Yuan went to the refrigerator. The space was too narrow for 2 people. He put the groceries in the refrigerator and looked with interest at what was in there. It turned out that the girl was a good cook. The young man furtively looked at Ruoqin, who was standing at the kitchen sink, and thought that it would be nice to live together with her. Then he could come home from work every day in a solid dark suit and tell me from the doorstep that he was already home, and his dear wife would ask him what he wanted more. She would offer him a choice of a hot bath or a meal. Zhou Yan imagined Ruoqin in a short dress that barely concealed her lush form. Instead of food, the embarrassed wife was offering herself. Meanwhile, the girl sat down on the bed. She asked the master if he had any obscenities in the men's room. Zhou Yuan smiled and made it clear that he liked the girl. He stated that there was nothing like that in his apartment. The guest jabbed her finger at the small-size blue flip-flops and angrily asked what that could mean. The young man was horrified. The barrel of the automatic rifle was peeking out from under his bed. It was also shining treacherously. There was absolutely no other way out. Zhou Yuan couldn't let his arsenal be discovered and jumped at the surprised girl. They had never been this close to each other before, so the guy made his guest blush. Besides, the young man had actually pinned her to the bed with his body, and the realization of that forced her to embarrass herself even more. Mastering herself, Ruoqin pushed the guy aside. He apologized and exclaimed that he lost his temper because of her beauty. Still continuing to be embarrassed, the girl got up from the bed, trying not to look at her master. She said she was fine. Walking out of the apartment door, Ruoqin said that this kind of behavior is common to many young guys. The young man was saddened. He had saved the weapon, but he had lost his reputation. Of course, the guest would surely hate him now. To his surprise, Ruoqin looked out from behind the door in farewell, and embarrassedly said that she was very happy to hear such words. The door slammed shut. The girl left. For several minutes, Zhou Yuan was in silent silence. The confused guy could not believe that all this had really happened to him. It turned out that their feelings were mutual. The young man began to slap his cheeks to bring himself back to reality. The time for the transition to the other world was approaching, and he needed to prepare himself. He was walking through town and pondering how he could make money. Buying canned goods in huge quantities would immediately attract attention. Nearby, a man with a placard stood by a truck filled with sacks of potatoes and offered to buy his goods. Zhou Yuan thought that this idea was not so bad. The profit would be small, but you could buy potatoes in any quantity. Moreover, the owner was even willing to make a 20% discount. His trade was not going well. The young man looked at the quality of the potatoes and exclaimed that he was buying. The man asked how many sacks he was willing to buy. The guy smiled and said he would buy his entire crop provided the seller delivered it to his door himself. The man realized that the buyer was embarrassed by his frail appearance. He tore off his clothes and exposed his powerful torso. Already after the transaction was completed, Zhou Yuan belatedly thought that it would be a good idea to inquire about the quantity of goods first. His whole room was filled to the ceiling with potatoes. The young man was now not sure he would be able to sell them in time. By the time the guy hit the market in the apocalyptic world, trade was well underway. Zhou Yuan loaded up a full backpack of potatoes this time. He wondered what he could get in exchange. In one of the nooks and crannies, the young man came across a small smithy and was very surprised. He thought that no one needed swords anymore. A large blacksmith was relentlessly sputtering red-hot metal and shouting that he had the best weapons in town. The guy came closer and asked if hunters often acquire their own cutting and stabbing weapons. The man explained that gunshots attract zombies. In addition, firearms need constant maintenance. Zhou Yuan opened his mouth in surprise. In that case, buying a sword or dagger made sense, and he would learn how to handle it quickly. The young man liked a halberd with a short shaft. He asked about the price of the goods. The blacksmith was only interested in good food. The boy said unhesitatingly that he had some potatoes. In his heart, he doubted that the man would pay attention to her. As soon as the seller picked up the potatoes, his eyes shone with happiness. He exclaimed delightedly that the product was wonderful. The long-ago memories made the man almost cry. In exchange for her, he was willing to give the young man the best katana in his store. The blacksmith took the sword out of its sheath and told me that it was his best work, with crystals embedded in the blade to do more damage. Turns out the blade has another feature. The more zombies it kills, the sharper it becomes. Zhou Yuan was almost dancing with joy. He had managed to bargain such a powerful weapon for just a sack of potatoes. Without wasting any time, the young man called up the system menu and exchanged 100 experience points for the basic sword skill. The boy felt considerably more confident now. With his sword in his hand, he strolled through the nearby dense forest. The zombies quickly smelled the new victim and rushed after him with wild cries, making no secret of their presence. With a slight movement of his finger, Zhou Yuan opened the scabbard and smirked gloatingly. Stupid creatures can't tell the difference between weak people and strong people. Those zombies continued to chase him like normal prey, not even realizing they were chasing the hunter. The young man turned around and with his first blow easily cut off the head of the first pursuer, then did the same operation with the second. After a few seconds, it was all over. The dangerous monsters lay on the ground, their blood still dripping from the blade. Zhou Yuan turned the katana toward him. Its blade was shining in such a way that it could be used instead of a mirror. Taking the hunter's advice, the young man approached the decapitated creature and rummaged around for the crystal. These zombies were not very strong. Only a white crystal could be obtained. Suddenly, the sound of gunfire could be heard in the forest. The first shot from the small pistol killed the fleeing monster. The bullet hit him right in the head. A pretty huntress in a black top and shorts lamented that she wouldn't even have enough crystals for ammunition. Suddenly, a larger zombie jumped out from behind a tree. Its teeth were more animal-like in shape, and its long tongue could be mistaken for a necktie. The Amazon was immediately excited. If she managed to kill a level 2 monster, she would have enough money for ammunition and food. The huge monster came closer and closer. He smelled fresh meat and stuck out his tongue all the way to his knee. As she reloaded the magazine in her gun, the girl stopped cheering. She realized that such bullets could not kill a zombie. In addition, there was a major mishap. The zombie wrapped his tongue around Shuno's wrist and pulled it towards him. The girl loosened her grip because of the jerk. The cartridge case fell to the ground with a clatter. The cartridges spilled out of it. The huntress gasped in fear. She realized that in a few seconds this vile beast would eat her alive. The zombie grabbed the girl by the waist. She shrieked in growing terror as she climbed higher and higher into the trees. Despite all her strength, there was nothing Shuno could do. The zombie pressed her elbows securely against her ribs with his tongue. Not only was it wrapped around her torso, but it was also trying to lick her cheeks. The huntress cringed. It was very nasty. She screamed for help as hard as she could and kicked her legs through the air trying to break free. Unfortunately, the grip was firm. Zhou Yuan rushed to Shuno's rescue as fast as he could. With his sword in front of him, he rushed towards the enemy. With a lightning strike of his blade, the young man severed his tongue, from which green stinking liquid immediately flowed. The zombie began to howl from the intense pain and the realization that he had lost his main advantage over humans. Rejoicing at the quick victory, the boy vowed to see it through and rushed forward, hoping to slay the monster with a single blow. By this time, the zombie had already managed to fully regenerate its tentacle tongue and attacked the young warrior. The monster quickly encircled the sharp blade in several places. Zhou Yuan realized that this zombie was too strong. The tentacle darted toward the forest, unfurling on its way. The young man was horrified to see his katana flying into the thicket. The monster laughed victoriously. Instead of one victim, he suddenly got a second one who couldn't hide either. Suddenly, several large bullets slammed into his body. The zombie looked around perplexed. He didn't want to believe this was happening to him. Zhou Yuan was laughing now. He shouted to the exhausted monster that he still had weapons left. Bending over the corpse, the self-satisfied young man obtained a level 2 blue crystal. He spent relatively little ammunition. Suddenly, the guy remembered the reason he was here in the first place. He turned to look at the girl. The huntress was lying on the ground with no signs of life. Her whole body was covered with drops of green liquid. Zhou Yuan knew that this substance could be very poisonous and should have been washed away immediately with running water. Fortunately, there was a mountain river nearby. The young man carried the Amazon to the water and washed the green liquid off her body. After a while, Shuno began to come to her senses. Since her top had fallen into disrepair, the guy covered her with his clothes. When the huntress woke up, she was surprised to find that she was wearing only shorts. She immediately blushed as she covered her body and cried out that this just wasn't supposed to happen. Zhou Yuan was glad that the girl had woken up. He was standing behind her with his torso exposed. The young man introduced himself to the huntress. The Amazon threw the first stone she could find at her savior out of indignation and asked why she was in this state. The guy had no trouble catching the stone and explained with a smile that her whole body was covered in poison. Here he had to wash the girl. Shuno hid her face in shame. She didn't want to believe that the young man had washed her entire body. Zhou Yuan said that he had only washed up to his waist. It didn't make much difference anyway. The girl was ready to fall through the ground in shame. The stranger had seen her naked. The young man stated that he had boiled 2 potatoes and was willing to give them to the stranger as an apology. She shouted that her body was worth much more. As soon as the potatoes were broken, the huntress stopped being angry. She looked completely at peace, the food exuding a divine flavor. The young man handed her the jar and offered to salt it. The Amazon was even more surprised. She had not seen salt for a long time. Taking a pinch of salt, the girl salted half a potato and said that salt was very popular in the city market. She took a bite of some potatoes with relish and explained that such a delicacy could only be found in this place. Zhou Yuan was quick to grasp the new opportunity. Salt could be a great option for quick enrichment in the apocalypse. The huntress finished her potatoes and got up from the ground. She asked the surprised boy if he could sell her all his salt. The young man held out a container of salt to the Amazon and exclaimed that there was no need to sell. He could give her the salt for free. The girl couldn't believe her happiness and timidly held out her hand. Zhou Yuan said that it was just a bag of salt. This guy was very strange. Shuno knew very well that such salt would cost several tens of grams of gold in a store. Meanwhile, the young man continued to surprise her more and more. He smiled and asked if the beautiful woman would like to have an endless supply of food and salt. Of course, the girl wanted to have plenty of food. Unfortunately, she had a very limited supply of crystals knocked off the zombies. Zhou Yuan leaned closer to the embarrassed huntress and offered to use something else to pay. For example, his body. Shuno reacted instantly and pushed the young man away from her. She shouted that she wouldn't go for it. The Amazon instinctively closed her body and wailed that she wouldn't sell herself for food, even if she was severely hungry. The young man smiled embarrassedly and explained that that was not what he meant. She would work for him, using her power. The girl grabbed him by the collar and started shaking him, admonishing him not to be so ambiguous. She exclaimed that she agreed to the young man's terms but would only take on the battles. He could not even dream of anything else. Zhou Yuan smiled lustfully, trying to imagine what the beautiful Shuno meant by other favors. His imagination painted a girl in seductive white clothes and a red bow around her neck. The Amazon immediately noticed that her interlocutor looked too strange. She suspected that the young man represented her, his fists clenched by themselves. Shuno took his throat in a lock so hard that the guy's eyes almost flew out of his orbits. After resting for a while, the hunters moved into the forest. Zhou Yuan said that he only saw level 1 and 2 zombies. The girl said that the monsters are divided into 9 levels, but only zombies up to level 3 can be found in this area. The young man noticed that he had only heard of 8 ranks. He asked his companion where the 9th rank had come from. Turns out level 9 can manifest itself in very different ways. If you're lucky, it will equal the strength of a level 1 zombie. On the other hand, the hunter has a certain chance of encountering a creature that will be stronger than a rank 8 monster. In the refugee camp, a man sat under a tree and dozed, flies circling around him. The young man couldn't stand it and clutched his nose, complaining about the terrible stench. The huntress smiled. She herself had long since gotten used to it. The girl explained that the refugees had frequent water shortages. They didn't wash for weeks. The young man asked how long it had been since she herself had taken water treatments. Shuno shouted indignantly that she often washed in the river. Zhou Yuan said jokingly. At this moment, a white-haired girl ran out towards the huntress and waved her hands. She was happy to see Shuno alive and unharmed. The girl with glasses was burning with the desire to show off her new things. She showed the Amazon who had run up to her a solar panel. Wen said that this thing could be used to generate energy. Suddenly, Zhou Yuan saw that their interlocutor had bowed her head very strangely, as if she couldn't hold it back. At the same moment, the girl with glasses began to fall to the ground. The young man realized that she was losing consciousness and ran up to support her. He lifted Wen up and helped her sit up. When she opened her eyes, she reluctantly admitted that she was very hungry and could barely stand on her feet. The boy immediately held out a potato and smiled. The girl's eyes were beaming with delight. She hadn't eaten anything like this in a long time. Zhou Yuan asked his companion what her girlfriend's name was. Shuno looked back at the girl and said that it was her roommate. At this time, her acquaintance herself gave a friendly smile and said that she works here as a programmer. Her name is Wen. Shuno disdainfully folded her arms on her chest and declared that all these electronic gadgets were completely useless. Wen was very surprised. Her friend rarely allowed herself to be so rude towards her. After all, both are doing their jobs. The programmer bowed her head dejectedly. Almost crying, she had to agree that potatoes were more valuable than any program. Zhou Yuan intervened in the conversation and asked what kind of program they were talking about. Perhaps he would even purchase it in exchange for potatoes. It made a certain amount of sense. Many people were wasting their talent, and the young man hoped to build a business with them. The programmer showed me a flash drive. There is a program called Evolution on it. It allows you to evolve on your own. This idea intrigued the guy. He immediately had several ideas on how to use the software. Wei Wai admitted that the program is not over yet. She will most likely give up and become a hunter. The young man had an idea. He put his hand on the girl's shoulder and promised to provide her with food if she finished the program. Wei Wai agreed. She had a few familiar programmers in mind. The only problem was their diet. Zhou Yuan exclaimed that he was willing to provide food for all of them. The girl wept with happiness and thanked the young man sincerely. Shuno defiantly turned away and angrily exclaimed that for food and she could find zombie hunters. The guy smiled and informed her that this was part of his plans. If the girl found people, she would get food and weapons. Shuno couldn't believe it. It sounded too beautiful to be true. The young man said he wasn't kidding. The girl could not stand it and threw herself on his neck with happiness, exclaiming that he was really a very interesting man. While Zhou Yuan was trying to figure out what was going on, Shuno hugged him even tighter. She was satisfied that she had found this guy. In the next moment, the girl was already happily running away and promised that he would find the right people very soon. Half an hour later, the huntress had indeed brought 6 fighters with her. Unfortunately, this number of men was not enough. The young man incredulously inquired why she had brought so few people with her, and said she could have looked better. The girl assured me that these guys are very skillful. If you feed them enough, they will hunt even better. Zhou Yuan showed the potatoes in his sack, and explained that the more they helped each other, the more they would earn. 2 boys by a thick tree were discussing his fighting qualities in disbelief. One of them mentioned the young man's cowardice. In the same second, the bullet whistled past the young men's heads and embedded itself between them in the center of the tree trunk. The boys froze in horror. Zhou Yuan glumly surveyed his squad. Smoke was still flowing from his gun. The young man said that he could also be violent. Both fighters immediately swore to serve him faithfully. With so much food, they could hunt. Zhou Yuan immediately became proud and felt like an immortal leader. He exclaimed that he needed to acquire weapons first. Meanwhile, a couple of zombie lovers were strolling through the dense forest. They were holding hands and not thinking about anything bad. The shots rang out virtually simultaneously. The monster's body fragments were scattered all around. They didn't stand a chance. Those guys really weren't bad hunters. Zhou Yuan had to admit that they knew their business. After retrieving 2 blue crystals from zombie corpses, the young man asked to shoot at the head next time, as it would use less ammunition. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound in the bushes. A disgruntled fat man with a sword came out and shouted, "No outsiders are allowed to hunt in the territory of the Hungry Wolf Gang." The man recognized the huntress and angrily exclaimed that Shuno would not be able to rob his territory again. Guys armed to the teeth appeared on either side of the girl. The warrior smiled and asked what he would say now. Suddenly, a small group of enemies came in the rear. One of them demanded that the hunters give them their weapons. Zhou Yuan turned his head back slightly and smiled. He said that as a child, a man should have been taught not to aim at other people. He shouted that it looked very rude from the outside and jumped at the offender, pulling his katana out of its sheath. His opponent laughed. Any kid knows that a bullet is faster than any katana. He just won't have time to do anything. At the same second, sharp steel slashed his wrist. The young man stared in amazement at the falling gun his fingers were holding. The mercenary immediately fell to the ground, clutching the stump of his arm, blood gushing from it. He yelled in a low voice that he had lost his arm. Zhou Yuan frowned and asked him to tell the elder that from now on, the people from the refugee camp did not obey him. The hunters themselves trembled with fear when they saw the boss in anger. The man wailed that the young man would still be held accountable for all of this. Their boss could single-handedly massacre zombies. He ordered the others to return to base. It was time to tell the boss and deal with the refugees. Zhou Yuan asked them to take their time. The man shook with fear. He didn't know what awaited him yet, but he was already panicking. The young man smiled and stated that no one dared insult them with impunity, so he asked to give up everything the mercenaries had with them. The man turned black with anger. This was even worse than he had expected. He'd rather die in battle than suffer humiliation. All 5 mercenaries were forced to undress and neatly fold their uniforms and provisions. They sat obediently on their knees. Zhou Yuan recalled that their gang had been harassing refugees for years, and this was only a small part of it. He dismissed the captives dismissively. Late that evening, the humiliated mercenaries returned to their secure base hidden deep in the forest. On a padded throne under a poster with the gang's emblem sat the leader. The man knelt before him, trying to explain his failure. The dark-haired giant began to rise from his throne. He shouted that those refugees were just a pack of miserable dogs depending on their master. The leader of the mercenaries rejoiced. He said that the wolf gang should avenge the refugees for their men. The man with the huge scar scowled and told his subordinate that there was no place in their gang for trash who refused to fight. The mercenary realized that things were not going in his favor, and he trembled with fear. He begged the leader to spare him. The leader turned into a giant wolf and bit the throat of the offending member. The man grunted. At this time, the atmosphere in the refugee camp was very different. Everyone was jovial, clinking beer glasses with each other. In honor of the glorious hunt, Zhou Yuan made a feast and declared that no one should limit himself in food or drink. All the hunters happily raised one glass after another in honor of the glorious leader and congratulated him on his success. The 2 mercenaries had had enough. And they wanted to leave the party as soon as possible. The next morning was hard on everyone. There were empty bottles lying around the boss's mat, carelessly left on the floor. Zhou Yuan could barely lift his body from the bed. He had a terrible headache after yesterday's celebration. Suddenly, a third hand slipped out from under the blanket. Even in his hangover, he knew perfectly well that it wasn't his own hand. A slender maiden's hand slid down his muscular torso. Zhou Yuan watched her movement with astonishment. The head of a satisfied Shu No emerged from under the blanket. She mumbled through her sleep that she wouldn't mind doing it again sometime. The boss's feat inspired his hunters and boosted their morale. One of the refugees firmly told the fat man that no one was afraid of him now. The man shouted that a bunch of weapons didn't make them stronger. Their hungry band of wolves would make quick work of the rebels. Zhou Yuan appeared in the fat man's way. He pointed a gun at the man and demanded that he stay out of his way. The representative of the wolves decided to show that he was not afraid of anyone himself. He jabbed his finger at his forehead and offered to shoot if he had the guts. The sudden gunshot nearly stopped the fat man's heart. He didn't realize the bullet was meant for the monster. The man was so shaken by panic that he fell to the ground. When he saw the dead monster lying next to him, he was even more frightened. The mercenary was scared to death. The zombie beside him lay with its head blown off, blood gushing from its throat. Zhou Yuan said glumly, "The mercenary had nowhere to go. He would end his life just like this monster." The fat man immediately got up from the ground and ran away, threatening that the young man would regret it. The hungry wolves would take their revenge on him. The guy was sick of hearing about this gang. He turned to Shu No and asked where the gang had come from. It turned out that at one time there were few resources in the refugee camp and some people left, sharing the nearby area among themselves. Fatty was running as fast as he could to his base. He was eager to take revenge on that insolent man as quickly as possible and teach him a lesson. Not far from his camp, the man stopped. His eyes refused to believe what he saw. There was a terrible picture before him. The fat man's hands dropped helplessly. His eyes reflected boundless terror. He couldn't imagine such a thing. All his men had been slaughtered, and there was no one left alive. The fire in the middle of the camp was burning peacefully, and the sentries were nowhere to be found. While the fat man was looking around, a huge zombie of 1.5 human height grew behind him. When he saw the huge shadow in front of him, the man turned around in surprise. He immediately realized that he was dealing with a third-level monster. His screams of terror could be heard throughout the neighborhood. Even the mercenary squad vaguely echoed the fat man's shrieks. Zhou Yuan was the first to assess the danger and demanded that everyone be alert. They might encounter the enemy very soon. The bushes moved. A fat man jumped out of them. He cried out for help as hard as he could, realizing that he could not escape. In the same second, the monster's huge hand caught up to the man, slowly clenching around his head. The mercenary screamed even louder. Wrapping his arms around the man's head, the giant lifted him high into the air. The fat man squealed and begged to be released. The monster's eyes burned greedily with red lights. It held the man tightly, intending to send him into its jaws. He bit the fat man's head off in front of the terrified hunters. One of the men shouted that it was a level 3 zombie. He and his partner decide to flee. It's clear they can't stand up to the giant anyway. Zhou Yuan turned to them and coldly explained that if they fled, they would all die. He demanded that they prepare for battle. The young man ordered the monster to open fire and set an example himself. The bullets from his automatic pistol hit the target. Behind him, all the hunters started shooting at the large zombie. Unfortunately, it didn't have much effect. Everyone was shooting wherever they wanted. The captain divided the hunters into 2 groups and ordered one to aim for the head and the other to shoot at the legs, slowing the monster down. The young man's strategy worked. After a few seconds, the zombie growled unhappily, dodging bullets that prevented it from moving quickly. Those hunters who a few minutes ago wanted to run away were now happily firing at a large target. The monster roared loudly and began to transform right before my eyes. Armor-piercing bullets bounced off its thick hide. Shuno turned pale with fear. She exclaimed that this level 3 zombie had mutated and would be even more difficult to deal with. Shuno was not feeling very well either. She had just started to wake up and was wiping her eyes. It had been a long time since she had drunk so much. Zhou Yuan had already wiped his eyes by this point and was surprised to find a half-naked girl getting up from his bed. The huntress felt his gaze and turned around. A terrible thought flashed through her mind, how they could have woken up together. Shuno pounced like an enraged tigress and demanded an explanation as to how she could have ended up in the same bed with the guy. At this time, a happy Wen looked into the tent. She was happy to tell me that the program had already been finalized. Seeing a half-naked couple covered with a blanket, the girl embarrassedly suggested that she had walked in at a bad time. As they pulled away from each other, they began to embarrassingly prove that nothing had actually happened between them. The programmer smiled and said she knew about it. She put them together herself since there was only one bed. Shuno indignantly squealed that undressing wasn't necessary. The girl explained that they had thrown up and the clothes had to be removed. The huntress continued to shout that Wen did it on purpose and pinched her girlfriend's cheek hard. When everyone calmed down, the programmer approached the young man and handed him a flash drive with the program. She assured him that anyone could handle it. Zhou Yuan suspected that she was trying to hurt him and remarked resentfully that he often had to deal with programs. Either way, he got what he wanted. The young man smiled, clasping the flash drive in his fist. This was opening up new opportunities for growth. My time in the apocalypse world was over, and I had to go back to my dreary office to go about my normal business. Lynchun stated as he sent him the documents. They needed to be done by the end of the day, or else the guy would be left without any bonuses. The young man turned aside and sullenly nodded his head. The manager walked away, smirking surreptitiously. Who better than him to know it was a full week's work? At least the trainee would have something to do. Suddenly, Zhou Yuan felt Su Rochin's massive chest descend onto his head. He froze in surprise. The young woman offered to help the young man with his work. She apologized that she couldn't do it earlier. She was busy herself. Zhou Yuan embarrassedly squealed that he didn't need any help. The female employee pulled back in surprise and said that he could apply at any time. The young man had his reasons for doing so. With the girl out of the way, he could finally see what Wen's program could do. Her utility was really easy to use. The instructions helped me figure out what to do. The result exceeded all expectations. Judging by the program's readings, all the work the manager had loaded him with could be done in a few minutes. The utility was also able to remotely connect to other computers. The guy was curious to see who was doing what. The alopecia-afflicted Lao Xing did not deceive his expectations. He stared at the monitor again, looking at the pretty sisters. Suddenly, Zhou Yuan saw Lin Shun chatting with an employee of a rival company. This was very suspicious. The young man was overjoyed. He finally had a decent chance to teach the manager a lesson for his insults. 2 hours later, Lin Shun himself came to the office and announced that the trainees had overtime work. It was very urgent. All the trainees slumped. They had already gotten used to the fact that overtime was not paid, and their labor was simply used mercilessly. Zhou Yuan stood up and said loudly that he was just forcing everyone to do his job. The manager exclaimed that this was slander. The young man scattered the printed sheets around the office and stated that every employee could see for themselves. The two interns immediately recognized the other game company's project and resented it. All this time they had been doing someone else's work for free. Even the exposure did nothing. Lin Shun exclaimed without a shadow of embarrassment that the trainees were doing nothing for the company anyway. At this moment, Director Chen appeared behind his back. After taking a closer look at someone else's project, he demanded that the manager explain everything. Lin Shun panicked. Stammering, he tried to prove that he had nothing to do with this project. The man didn't say a word. Frowning, he stood and looked at the manager in a way that he realized. Director Chen promised that he would punish him fairly. Lin Shun made one last attempt to justify himself. Suddenly, the manager saw some strange movement behind the manager's back and frowned. This did not bode well. At this moment, Zhou Yuan walked out from behind him. As he approached the director, the young man said that he had submitted his resignation. Following him, the rest of the trainees came out. They shouted in one voice that they wanted to leave as well. Lin Shun almost exploded with anger. All the staff members left, only Director Chen and Lin Shun remained. They stood silently observing the empty tables. The man stated that Lin Shun had tried very hard. It was his fault that many employees left in the middle of the project. The manager hoped to the last minute that everything would go away. The director made him write his resignation letter. Lin Shun fell to his knees. It was the end of everything. After going outside, Zhou Yuan apologized to the employees. They were hurt because of his personal feud with the manager. The former trainees revealed that Lin Shun had been annoying them for a long time. Sooner or later, there was going to be an end to it. One of the guys grimaced and said that now he would have to look for a new job. He has no idea what to do now. Zhou Yuan smiled and informed that he had some money. He was going to go into business and would be happy to work with them. All three boys were very excited. The offer was tempting, especially since they had seen his business acumen for themselves. The next day, the young man traveled to his settlement in the apocalypse world. He used the money he had saved to buy some materials. With enough money on hand, it was time to think about starting my own company. Suddenly, Zhou Yuan heard the roar of motorcycle engines and some shouting. He perplexedly turned around. The hunters on motorcycles stopped outside the tent. One of the motorcyclists shouted that the girl was in danger. The young man did not understand anything from his confused explanation and demanded a clear account of what exactly had happened. It turned out that a gang of hungry wolves attacked the hunters during the procurement. Shu No sacrificed herself and lured them into the dense forest. Zhou Yuan jumped on the motorcycle and asked him to gather all the people, and he would handle the rescue of the girl himself. The young man's body shook with anger. He hadn't counted on the bandits coming to the refugee camp while he was away. The guy was squeezing all the speed he could out of the red sport bike. He suspected that time was short. Meanwhile, the yellow jeep driven by Shu No wagged along the forest road. The yellow jeep that Shu No was driving was swerving along the forest road. 3 motorcyclists from the Hungry Wolf gang tried to chase her down. One of them shouted that you can't just leave their territory. At first, everything was going well. The girl managed to evade the chase. She thought that the pursuers were just playing a game of tag with her. After a few minutes, Shu No found that the situation had worsened. The motorcyclists were traveling parallel to the main road. Cutting across the path, the forest bandits jumped out in front of her on the road, blocking further traffic with their motorcycles. Smirking, one of the mercenaries put his hands on the handlebars of the motorcycle and asked how far the beauty was going to ride. His 2 accomplices got off their motorcycles. One of them was armed with a pistol. The other had a bat with nails half nailed into it. Suddenly, a huge explosion sounded from behind the bandits. All 3 of them turned around in surprise. Apparently, one of the motorcycles had exploded. The forest bandits panicked. They could see that the girl had nothing to do with it, but the engine couldn't have exploded on its own. Meanwhile, out of nowhere came a teddy bear with a lit wick. The toy got stuck on the face of one of the young men. One of the mercenaries realized too late what surprise was hidden in the child's toy, and did not have time to warn his comrade. The bear, along with the bandit's head, was torn apart at the same second. The mercenary standing next to him was covered in his brother's blood. A small blonde-haired girl in a purple dress slowly emerged from behind the trees. In her hand, she held a hand grenade with the image of a hamster on it. The warrior immediately announced that her name was Tina, and pulled the grenade's pin, laughing gloatingly. The 2 surviving bandits were shaking with fear as they realized that the aptly thrown grenade was flying straight at them. The powerful explosion shredded the mercenaries' bodies and the parts of their motorcycles into tiny fragments. They had no chance to escape. Tina squawked in satisfaction, and exclaimed that you should carry an explosive weapon for such occasions. Shuno stepped out of the yellow car. She was very happy that her familiar little Tina was in the neighborhood. Unable to resist, the huntress ran up to the rescued girl and happily wrapped her arm around her. It turned out she was having fun with a zombie nearby. Shuno was very grateful to her acquaintance. She was on the brink of death. Those bandits probably wouldn't let her leave alive. Tina was pleased to hear the praise for herself. Shuno hugged her and stroked her head. They both closed their eyes in pleasure. As it turned out, the huntresses were not alone here. A huge silhouette was slowly approaching them from behind the thick trees. The leader of the Hungry Wolf gang came out of hiding with a predatory smile. Greed flashed in his eyes. Suddenly, a burned hand tried to grab his leg. The Volkov leader turned around and saw the burned body of his companion. The man groaned and begged to be saved. The leader stared contemptuously at the remains of what had recently been a fighter. He angrily stepped on his neck, ending the mercenary's worthless life. It was the boy's own fault. They had a simple task. He offered Tina to join the Hungry Wolves gang. The man promised the girl that she would become strong and famous. The explosive little girl smiled and exclaimed that she had heard of the Hungry Wolves gang leader's raw strength. She lightning fast threw 3 grenades at him at once, one after the other, and cheerfully asked if it was true. There was a huge explosion. Tina cheerfully shouted that she got 10 points for this round and the bully got none. Immediately after the first, another large explosion sounded. Both grenades exploded almost simultaneously. When the smoke cleared a little, the enraged leader of the wolves showed up. He shouted angrily that the game had just begun. The cries of surprised and frightened girls echoed throughout the neighborhood. The young man heard them too, and his heart sank into his heels. Zhou Yuan guessed that Shuno was in that direction. It was now quite clear that she was in trouble. Unfortunately, the bike was already traveling at top speed. The young man wished he could go even faster. After a few minutes, the guy pulled over. He felt as if he had to go faster to save the girl. Seeing the leader of the wolves in front of him, Zhou Yuan was a little surprised. He had expected to deal with a gang of bandits. Stepping a foot on Shuno's head, the wolf leader asked if the hero would have time to come and rescue the 2 beauties. Tina was lying nearby on the ground. The young man's anger had no limit. Cursing the wolf leader and his entire gang, Zhou Yuan rushed to attack. The man laughed and showed him the middle finger on both hands. He was glad he'd gotten the kid mad. Zhou Yuan's fists clenched by themselves. He could not endure this kind of bullying, and was determined to finish off the wolf clan. A lightning-fast punch slammed into the left cheek of the giant. He had to admit that his opponent was very fast. The impact was serious even by the Hungry Wolves gang leader's standards. The collision with his body caused the thick tree trunk to break. The young man ran up to his companion Shuno and gently took her in his arms. He asked how she was feeling. The huntress tried to smile as much as she could. It felt good to be in this guy's arms. The gang leader stood up and shook himself off. This little incident had amused him. The little brat was not to be bored. The man groped the bruised spot and smiled. Well, he would make him pay for every abrasion on his body. Carelessly tossing the remains of the tree aside, the gang leader rushed forward. He shouted that it was his turn to test the boy's strength. The giant clenched his fist and boastfully promised that he was about to show the young man what true strength was. Zhou Yuan calmly looked at his opponent. He crossed his arms, trying to block his opponent's blow. The young man recognized that the giant was moving quite fast. The clan leader mockingly shouted that it was all useless and punched the guy. He flew a few meters and hit a tree. Zhou Yuan squatted down and thought for a moment. The gang leader was much stronger. We would have to add a couple of skills. Quickly launching the system menu, the first thing the guy did was buy himself a medium combat skill and a base strength improvement. Unfortunately, the system store didn't offer much in the way of combat skill enhancements. Nevertheless, the young man felt a very strong surge of energy throughout his body after spending 50 points in the store. The leader of the Hungry Wolf gang was already anticipating his victory. He knew very well that he could easily handle the boy, so he tried to hit him. To his surprise, something strange happened. That weakling calmly grabbed his rushing fist. The man couldn't understand how this could have happened. No matter how hard he tried, straining all his muscles, he still couldn't break the kid, as if he was dealing not with a human, but with a robot. Zhou Yuan laughed victoriously. From the way he easily caught his opponent's quick hand, the future outcome of the battle was predictable. Rushing forward, the young man grabbed the head of the Wolf clan by the elbow with his free hand and pulled his body toward him. A second later, Wolf flew down. Zhou Yuan deftly threw his huge opponent over himself. The man's back hit the ground painfully. The injuries caused him to cough up blood and wheeze heavily. The wolf was barely breathing, sweat streaming down his face. The man made no attempt to get up from the ground. Zhou Yuan punched him, and snidely wondered what else the leader of the Hungry Wolf gang was capable of. Suddenly, the man began to transform. His hands and feet began to turn into animal arms and legs and grow skin. A huge wolf's paw nearly struck the young man in the face, and he barely dodged it in time. The leader growled that he was finished now. The boy sat down on the ground frightened, unable to believe his own eyes. He asked in a huff what this strange monster was. The giant wolf with red eyes was at the young man's side in one leap and explained that no mortal could compare to the awakened one. This was the first time Zhou Yuan had heard this term and asked to elaborate, guessing that it didn't mean anything good. The huge wolf roared angrily that only those who attain power by devouring energy crystals could become awakened. Deciding that such an explanation to the kid was enough, the gray colossus leaped towards his opponent. The young man barely had time to jump back. Even so, the big wolf had left 3 claw marks on his body. The huge monster was creeping closer and closer. He promised his enemy that he would give him back that punch in the face twice as much. Zhou Yuan looked around. The 2 girls were lying right behind him. To avoid them, the monster should have been dragged away. He rushed off, shouting that he had a bone for the doggy. The leader became angry and growled that he was a wolf, not a dog. Running into the dense forest, the young man looked for a tall tree with comfortable branches and jumped on it. He was in time. The leader of the wolf clan would be here soon. All he had to do was wait for his foolish victim. The wolf got up on his hind legs and walked around the tree, sniffing at the familiar scent. He realized the brat was close by. Zhou Yuan jumped down on him from the tree, exposing his sword. He hoped that the stealthy attack would take the beast by surprise. The huge wolf crouched down and dodged the blow in the same second. He growled, pleased that his enemy had been fooled. The monster grabbed the young man by the neck and promised to bite his head off, explaining that his sense of smell was 10 times better than a human's. To his surprise, the guy didn't grovel and beg for mercy. Instead, he smiled and said that he had figured out how to beat him. The huge monster smirked gloatingly. He knew that he couldn't be defeated, so he was sure that Zhou Yuan was just buying himself time. The young man opened his mouth wide and breathed a foul odor on his opponent. The clan leader wrinkled his nose and let go of the boy's neck. The foul odor made the wolf's eyes water. He covered his muzzle with his paws and asked angrily what it was. The guy was happy to confess and gave away the secret of his kitchen. Smiling, he declared that such a smell would make any dog vomit. The wolf was even more enraged. This brat was getting on his nerves on purpose. Unfortunately, he still had to hold his nose with his paw. Zhou Yuan took out his sharp katana and explained that this was called tactics. He would now try out the skills of a swordsman. The blade strike was too quick. The wolf only had time to put its paw forward. Losing his paw, the monster howled bitterly. Now the Hungry Wolf clan's clan leader was completely useless. The young man finished the heroic battle rather quickly. Suddenly he saw that something was glowing brightly on the body of the huge wolf, and he went to take a closer look with interest. It turned out that the bright glow was due to the multicolored crystal in the chest of the monster he had killed. The boy was surprised to realize that he had obtained the rarest crystal in the world. He had never seen such a thing even in stores. The system notified that because of this, Zhou Yuan had obtained a new skill to control zombies. The young man almost danced with joy. Now he was even stronger and could surround himself with monsters as servants. Meanwhile, the system gave the guy a new task to build a shelter. If he failed, death awaited him. Zhou Yuan shouted that it was too cruel a condition. The system said that the final decision would be up to her. The young man bowed his head dejectedly. He didn't like it anymore. In any case, he needed to find those girls and think about his plan. A few hours later, Tina was already cheerfully telling him that Shu No had saved her life 3 years ago. Since then, she'd become an independent hunter. Zhou Yuan couldn't believe that such a little girl could become a complete hunter. Shu No asked not to underestimate her little friend. She belongs to the awakened. Tina explained that once infected, some people don't become zombies but gain superpowers. She smiled and said that her own skill was in making explosives from improvised means. Taking an ordinary mug in her hands, the huntress worked a little magic on it and offered to admire the result. She tossed it carelessly toward the entrance to the tent so the blast wouldn't hit any of her friends. As it flew outside the tent and made contact with the ground, the mug exploded as if it had been filled with explosives. Zhou Yuan stared in amazement at the miracle that had been created. He assumed that the awakened one could not be destroyed. Shu No desperately wrapped her head in different directions and explained that awakened could also be weak. For example, the wolf was a level 4. Tina said admiringly that she wished she could work together with Zhou Yuan. He was able to kill such a monster by himself. The young man smiled embarrassedly. He didn't mind working with the plucky huntress, the consummate master of explosions. After defeating the Hungry Wolves gang, Zhou Yuan learned quite by accident that the mercenary team had their own goals. Turns out the leader of the wolves wanted to take over their settlement and set up their base, so they're grateful for killing him. The young man waved his hand carelessly and said that it was all over. They could go back to the farm and get on with their business. One of the mercenaries reported that their farm was still under the control of the wolf gang, so they hoped to find shelter here. The boy looked thoughtfully around at the kneeling men. It looked like it was time to start building a shelter. At that moment, the huntresses ran up and started shouting loudly that they needed to get back at the insolent men. Tina would blow them all up. Meanwhile, the bandits of the Hungry Wolf clan were having a good time at the captured Dark Moon farm. They decided in a fistfight who should be in charge. Zhou Yuan walked closer and loudly said that the farm was quite crowded. The two fighters turned around unhappily. The young man and the girls were standing on a hill. The boy said cheerfully that each could become head by defeating the others in battle. Without waiting for an answer, he jumped down into the farmyard. With his fists clenched and his legs tucked under him, he flew like the wind. Zhou Yuan exclaimed that he could handle both of them and pushed their foreheads together. It was enough for them not to wake up anymore. Tina didn't waste any time either. The girl was happily tossing down one grenade after another, eager to see the fireworks. The bandits only recognized the girl with the grenades at the last moment and did not have time to escape. The sound of the explosion was heard throughout the forest. At that moment, the farmers appeared, armed with sticks and clubs. They were happy to expel the invaders from their home. Not half an hour later, all the bandits who had managed to survive the explosion lay beaten to a pulp. Zhou Yuan gathered all the farmers and solemnly declared that the Hungry Wolf gang no longer existed. The farm belonged to its owners. One of the mercenaries hinted that there might be other enemies nearby, so they would like the young man to take charge. The offer came in handy. The boy said he agreed to be their leader. They would live as a family and defend themselves together. All the farmers shouted with joy. They were very happy that they would live under a safe protection. Meanwhile, the system updated the mission data. It turned out that the farm skill points were at their lowest level. Zhou Yuan almost cried out in frustration. He couldn't believe that he had to spend so many crystals and gold for this task. At this moment, Wen came running over. Her eyes were beaming with happiness. She proudly announced that she had found the Wolfgang's safe. Leaning against the safe door in a seductive pose, she surmised that there must be a lot of treasure inside. The young man was nearly dying of embarrassment. He was a little embarrassed to look at the girl from this angle. He recognized that there was indeed plenty of treasure. The safe was filled almost to the top with crystals of various colors, mostly yellow, but there were some rare blue ones. Zhou Yuan couldn't get enough of the precious resource. Wen thought in other categories and calculated how many potatoes she could buy. The girl suggested that they needed more people to guard such wealth. Someone stronger might come along. The young man didn't ponder for long. Thanks to the gifts from the system, he knew how the labor issue could be solved. He walked over to the bandits who had been beaten to death and applied the zombie subjugation skill. He felt some change. The guy decided to start by reviving 3 dead people and test how the skill even worked. Reaching out his hand towards the bodies, Zhou Yuan demanded that they rise up. A transparent haze began to descend from his hand. The 3 dead men found themselves enveloped in a bluish, transparent mist within seconds. Suddenly, the fingers of one of them began to move. One by one, they slowly stood up, as if waking up after a long sleep. Without opening their eyes, the 3 bandits stood still, waiting for orders. The young man realized that they were perfect soldiers. Although Zhou Yuan had expected to see something like this, he was still surprised to see the corpses come to life. Shu No didn't need to be told twice. Pulling out her gun, she took aim and exclaimed that she would take care of them. The young man placed his hand on the girl's weapon and explained that these zombies now obeyed his orders. Zhou Yuan revealed that after defeating the gang leader, he had a new ability. He handed one of the zombies an axe. The young man exclaimed happily that now these creatures could be used as labor. A few minutes later, the zombies were chopping wood in a friendly manner. Unfortunately, they were working out of sync, and one of them accidentally chopped off the other's head without really paying attention. Shu No inquired about the efficiency of those resurrected ones. The guy admitted that it was difficult to control even one of them. Wen suddenly remembered that she had once made a device to control such creatures. Zhou Yuan was immediately interested and asked for a demonstration. The girl handed him a brainwave controller that looked like a helmet with virtual reality support. The young man put the device on his head and asked for more details on how to use the thing. Wen held out 2 small green and yellow-colored chips to him. She explained that they could receive and send brainwaves. There is a special slot in the right earpiece of the headset. One of the chips needs to be inserted inside and is immediately activated. Poking her finger into the zombie's forehead and ignoring its cries, the programmer said that a second chip was being inserted into its brain. Zhou Yuan tried to control the large zombie with interest. Both of his hands obeyed his master's order. It gave the illusion that the young man himself was in the body of a dead man. He grabbed the inside of Shuno's leg. Scratching his chin, the zombie mouthed in a guy's voice that it seemed fine. Movements were crisp. Hands felt good. The girl turned purple with anger and punched the resurrected dead man, turning toward him. The zombie fell on its back. Trying to regain consciousness in someone else's body, Zhou Yuan muttered that even this pain felt like real pain. The young man took off his brainwave controller and smiled. He said he needed the girl's help, had an idea. Both girls simultaneously asked what the idea was and why he needed girls specifically to carry out his plan. Zhou Yuan did not utter a single word. Simultaneously, several zombies rushed towards the huntresses. The first of them fell down after being kicked in the solar plexus. Dodging the monster's vile hands, Shuno fired 2 guns at once. The zombies fell one after another. The whole epic fight was filmed by a guy satisfied with his antics on a video camera. He asked for a couple more of the same footage. The girl was perplexed and asked why it was necessary to record on camera. The young man smiled and said that it was necessary preparations. Time passed quickly during the fun conversations. The young man returned to the real world and edited the video from the refugee village. The system menu of a video hosting site prompted a request to post a unique video on their site. Zhou Yuan uploaded the video to the site. He didn't know yet whether the idea would work and how many users would fall for the video, which he called a trailer for a video game. The next day, the bright rays of sunshine burst in through the window and woke the boy up. The sun was already high. Closing his eyes from the sun while wiping them after a nap, the young man realized he had just fallen asleep over his laptop. With a good yawn, the young man decided to look at the results of his work yesterday. He hoped that at least someone would be interested. Zhou Yuan quickly looked through the mail. Not finding anything worthy of attention, he moved on to the video hosting site. The boy immediately woke up from his astonishment. Such a phenomenal result could only be dreamed of. The video was viewed by 10 million users overnight. It quickly gained comments and went viral on the web. Zhou Yuan posted a picture of a scared-to-death Wen and wrote that he would choose 50 people from among the commentators to test the game. All over China, tons of people watched the game trailer with admiration. Each of them wanted to get access to the closed beta. At a computer game development company, a deputy reported to the chairman that a publisher for the game could not be found. Wang Xiaoqiao was pensively watching the trailer. She demanded that each staff member leave a comment underneath it. The girl wanted access to the beta very badly, realizing that this game would rush into the market like a hurricane. It wasn't just the players who were attracted to this project. A retired Special Forces officer, Chao Yi, was just cleaning his weapon. He watched the clip and couldn't believe it was a game. The weapon samples looked too realistic. Meanwhile, a man from a delivery service knocked on the door of an apartment in the city. He brought a package for a beautiful woman named Lao Tse-tsu. The girl was a professional streamer. She had a statuette on her desk, which testified to an audience of 5 million viewers. After turning on the live broadcast, Tse-tsu winked at her fans and showed off her brand new headset. She bragged that she got access to the beta of the game. Meanwhile, on the farm in the apocalypse world, work was in full swing. Wen was busy tweaking the necessary programs. Zhou Yuan, after hours of work, had just finished creating a game model based on Lao Zizi's photo. The game character looked very similar to a real girl. The young man was satisfied with the work done. After a while, the character work was finished. Zhou Yuan created 50 game models. Shuno couldn't understand why the young man needed to change the faces of the characters. After all, it was easy to make them look the same. The girl suspiciously suggested that the boy had some unhealthy hobby. The young man exclaimed that she would see for herself. In fact, Shuno was very close to the truth. All those players that Zhou Yuan invited to the test became models for the game. Using the zombie lord ability, the young man was able to make the faces of the corpses look just like the real players. Wen was constantly making sure that there were no failures. She couldn't believe that the guy had found 50 people. Zhou Yuan muttered that it was fine. He hoped that all 50 people would wear the helmets he had sent them with built-in chips. It was time to try things out in practice. Wen started the brainwave control program and shouted that it was okay to start. A model in the form of top streamer Lao Tse appeared in front of Shuno. She touched the girl and grudgingly said that the object was not moving at all. Suddenly, the crowd favorite opened her eyes and looked around in surprise. It was as if she was physically in the game. It was just unbelievable. The girl was jumping around and delightedly shouting to the audience that she had gotten to the same location that was shown in the trailer. Shuno turned to the young man and incredulously exclaimed that she couldn't believe it. The girl was acting as if she was alive. Lao Tse ran up to Shuno and hugged her, which made the girl blush. Streamer shouted that the touch felt real. The offended huntress slapped Tze's right cheek with the back of her hand. The bruised spot immediately turned purple. That didn't deter the streamer. She happily squealed that even the pain in this game feels very authentic, as if you were in another world. All the other game characters were also happy to be here. Everyone felt comfortable in this game. Wang Xiaoqiao also managed to get access to test the game. She was determined to get the rights to publish it. Qiao Yi evaluated his character's behavior and concluded that he moved much faster in the real world. Delicately coughing into his fist, Zhou Yuan drew the attention of the players present. The guy introduced himself and announced himself as the most important person in Dark Moon's hideout. He offered to join him. The first thing the young man warned was that when a character dies, the account is deleted. The player will need to create a new one. Lao Tz walked closer to the asylum manager and scrutinized him closely. This NPC looked like a real person. Zhou Yuan smiled and asked the embarrassed girl why she was looking at him so intently. Streamer crept closer and closer to the young man, holding a sharp dagger behind her back. Its steel gleamed brightly in the sun. Quickly jumping towards the guy, TZ put her knife forward and exclaimed that she wanted to experience the freedom of the game in action. The young man was faster. The next second, the girl fell breathless. There was a neat bullet hole in the middle of her forehead. All the other players saw that the body of the character who had attacked the asylum manager began to melt into thin air right before their eyes. Zhou Yuan defiantly showed everyone the gun and asked them not to do rash things next time. The three players murmured. No one wanted to lose their account. The only hope was that the rules would change after the game was released. At this moment, Lao Tz returned to the game location. She delightedly reported that even the feeling of death was real. Meanwhile, the manager demanded that non-player characters in the refugee camp not be touched. Unlike players, NPCs cannot be brought back to life. He explained in detail how to distinguish a player from an NPC. All you need to do is to use the observation function. Qiao Yi politely raised his hand and suggested that they could do whatever they wanted outside the camp. Xiao Qiao asked how a player could increase their strength and improve their equipment. Zhou Yuan said that after killing zombies, they could find crystals and exchange them for the right equipment. In addition, you can complete tasks for non-player characters in the shelter itself and get points in return for resource exchange. The young man explained how to call up the system menu. Each player can view information about his character at any time. Everyone began to call out the menu with interest. After receiving the information about herself, Xiao Qiao wondered. She had never seen this before. The shelter manager shot into the air, announcing the start of an exciting adventure. He wished everyone good luck. Lao Tz went for a walk in the forest and immediately came across two of her fans. They happily greeted the girl. Smiling, the streamer replied that right now she was more concerned with completing the tedious tasks in the shelter. She wanted to become strong quickly. Meanwhile, 3 green-skinned zombies appeared on the horizon. The girl shouted happily, attracting their attention. She proudly held up her dagger and boastfully announced that they would only be the first step on her path to glory. Not even 3 minutes later, Lao Tz and her fans stood shamefully outside the shelter. Their enthusiasm was gone. The monsters were proving to be strong. Streamer approached the asylum manager and asked if there were any tasks that didn't require combat skills. Zhou Yuan happily replied that each player could either cultivate the land or help build a house at will. Lao Tz found such a task acceptable for character enhancement. She smiled and asked to plow the ground. Looking at the players who were doing all the agricultural work, the young man got excited. All this was made possible thanks to virtual reality. Suddenly, a voice said that he would like to buy something. The boy turned around in surprise, his smile fading immediately. It turned out that Qiao Yi had found his place in this game and had brought a whole bunch of valuable red crystals. He assumed that they should be enough. Zhou Yuan couldn't believe his eyes. One of the 50 players had still managed to collect many crystals. Qiao Yi ostentatiously displayed a sharp dagger and said that it was very easy to find a couple of zombies, but he needed better equipment. The shelter manager smiled and held out the gun. He offered to buy it at a special price. The man checked the bolt mechanism and was surprised to say that the restored Browning appeared to be the real thing. The young man laughed. He assured that Qiao Yi would not regret the purchase. In the future, he would be able to buy more advanced equipment. Zhou Yuan looked appraisingly at the broad back of the departing commando. Such people could be useful to him in the future. Suddenly, the young man heard a female voice calling him and turned around perplexed. He asked Xiao Qiao what she wanted. The girl stated that she would like to try herself, but already with weapons and equipment. The boy explained that crystals were needed for that. The company chairman smiled and slyly said that she had no crystals. Zhou Yuan said that there was nothing he could do to help. Xiao Qiao smiled predatorily and said that any game is built on profit. She was willing to buy the goods directly for cash. The young man smiled and spread his hands. He admitted that there is no replenishment system in his game. All players earn experience honestly. The girl started to get angry. She exclaimed that she had enough money to even buy the game, let alone the equipment. The guy came very close to the chairman and gently took her by the chin. He explained that in the game, her real status didn't matter. Xiao Qiao angrily shouted that she would still find a way to get her way since it was impossible to directly fund the game account. Zhou Yuan laughed. He recalled that one could do many things in the game as long as it was not against the rules. The angry chairwoman immediately went to the plot where the land was being plowed. The girl offered to sell her the crystals for cash. They were eager to buy the red crystals from them. They offered to buy from them the red crystals, hard-won by physical labor. Zhou Yuan decided to use this in the future. A player who has money will be able to do whatever he wants. Satisfied with herself, Xiao Qiao returned to the young man with the bag of crystals. The boy gave her a rifle with a telescopic sight. In the meantime, Shu No went around the other areas. The workers were reporting to her about who had done what in the meantime. The girl smiled and said they did a wonderful job. She thanked the new employees sincerely. After getting 100 experience points each, the workers rejoiced like little children. A little more, and they would be able to exchange them for new equipment. The boys bowed to Shu No and asked her to give them more tasks. She sent them to repair the house and gather herbs. Seeing the adults happily running to do their new job, the girl wondered why they were so excited. 3 days passed. Zhou Yuan called a meeting in the Great Hall at a long table to talk about the process of the game. Wen looked over the papers and had to admit that the last 3 days of work had done a lot of work for low pay. Shu No smiled. She added that all those people looked very energetic and worked hard as if they were happy. As he was about to get up, the young man informed him that at this rate they would soon have to expand the shelter if nothing changed. A slightly worried Wen asked him not to leave. She needed to talk to him about something important. Shu No smirked gloatingly and assumed that the programmer just wanted to confess her feelings to the young man. When Shu No and Tina left the room, Zhou Yuan impatiently asked what Wen needed. The girl confessed that she is tormented by one question. She can't understand who really controls the doll's brainwaves. Zhou Yuan was a little surprised at the girl's insight. He had been told before that it was hard to find a beauty as smart as Wen. The young man told her that in some settlements there were only wealthy people. They have a lot of time on their hands, so they have fun. The programmer asked incredulously how in that case all those people had managed to end up here. The guy put his hand on her shoulder and asked her to just believe he actually lets everyone live a better life. Wen sighed heavily. She realized that she wouldn't find out anything anyway, so she agreed to keep working. Suddenly, Shu No burst into the room and shouted worriedly that help was needed. Something was happening outside. Lao Tse-tsu stood surrounded by a couple dozen men. One of them accused the girl of stealing. She had robbed his house. She herself saw nothing wrong with a player going into a non-player character's abode and opening his closet. Zhou Yuan and Shu No arrived at the scene of the showdown. The young man loudly demanded an explanation of what had happened. The man asked for justice to be done. Pointing at the self-satisfied girl, he said that TZ had broken into his house. Streamer stood her ground. With a frown, she reminded him that the game guaranteed complete freedom of action. Qiao Yi was beyond angry. He shouted that the robber girl had taken absolutely everything. The girl explained that she was testing the game's capabilities. Zhou Yuan was sure that Lao Tiezi would be useful to him in the future. He decided to meet her face to face. The young man suggested a fair fight. If the thief wins, he leaves, but if he loses, the girl is charged double payment. The landlord and the streamer looked at each other victoriously. Each of them was sure of their victory. The girl adopted a fighting stance and admitted with a smile that she had studied martial arts and other disciplines for several years. The man got tired of listening to this, and he knocked Lao Tiezi to the ground with a lightning-fast punch. She didn't even realize what had happened. Without letting the girl get up from the ground, Qiao Yi continued to beat her. Tiezi begged him not to beat her anymore. Zhou Yuan smiled and said that such a result was to be expected. The female robber didn't stand a chance. Because of the black eyes, Lao Zezi could barely see. She was clearly reluctant to hand over the red crystal as compensation. The manager of the asylum loudly announced to all the inhabitants that this would now always be the case. Anyone who broke the rules would pay the price. Meanwhile, in the internet cafes of the real world, players were passionately reading positive evaluations of the game and of the dark world. Considering that these reports were compiled by Lao Tse-tsu, the game really wasn't bad. Streamer was famous all over China. At this time, the girl herself was sitting at home at her computer with her legs tucked comfortably under her. Several empty bottles stood to her right. After finishing writing the game review, Lao Tiezi finished her beer. She was going to have a quick snack and return to the shelter. Unfortunately, A quick look around the room revealed the beer was out and there was no food in the house, so we'd have to go to the store. Tai Zi decided not to even change her clothes. She just threw a long jacket on top of her clothes and walked to the supermarket. To the girl's great joy, a single bottle of her favorite alcoholic beverage was found on the shelf. The streamer had barely reached for a bottle of beer when she was surprised to see someone's hand covering her own. Zhou Yuan smiled and said that he could concede this last bottle to the girl if she so desired. Lao Tiezi turned her hooded face. She thanked the young man whose face seemed very familiar to her. Looking closely at each other, the guy and girl were very surprised to recognize characters from the beta test of the popular game. The young people decided to celebrate a chance meeting in the real world and went to drink beer at Lao Tse-tsu's apartment. Laughing, the girl stated that she now realized why the refugee leader couldn't be killed. He turned out to be an ordinary man. Zhou Yuan faltered and admitted that his company had few employees now, and he had to set an example. Streamer got a little intoxicated. She was drawn to frankness. The girl agreed that the game was good, but its creator was not very cute. The young man decided to say what he thought too. He didn't suspect that such a beautiful girl could have a normal life. Her room was indeed a mess. Her clothes were lying carelessly on the floor and empty boxes were strewn everywhere. Lao Tse-tsu said that her fans are primarily interested in her personality rather than her looks or body. Zhou Yuan stared at the girl's breasts and said that it was impermissible to waste time with such a figure and attractive appearance. Streamer immediately blushed and looked away. She was very pleased to hear compliments about herself. The young man smiled smugly. He told the girl that there was no need to be embarrassed. Her figure was her advantage. The guy pulled out a notepad and suggested we talk about the game. He asked what else could be added to attract players. Tse-tsu immediately stated that the game has too little content. It would not hurt to add a dungeon system. Zhou Yuan now understood which way to go. He hugged his hostess with joy and exclaimed that it was very simple. At the very door, the young man waved his hand and said that he had to go improve his game. He thanked Lao Tz sincerely. The front door slammed shut. The girl was left alone. During the conversation, they ate all the food that was on the table. Streamer hugged her knees resentfully and grudgingly thought that the guy had left too quickly. He hadn't even asked her name. Upon entering the apocalyptic reality forest, Zhou Yuan immediately invoked the system menu to create a dungeon mode. The entire land was divided into 10 levels in terms of difficulty. In addition, creating dungeons cost the young man 500 points. After some thought, the guy selected the coordinates on the map for the first experiment. A purple portal appeared in front of the asylum manager. The system reported the creation of a test area for 4 people. Zhou Yuan really hoped that he hadn't laid out a whole 500 hard-earned points on the dungeon for nothing. After gathering the denizens of the asylum, the young man told them that they could experience a new mode with large rewards for a single topaz. The 3 boys got excited. They were immediately interested in the new mode. One of them asked if anyone had already been there. Zhou Yuan furtively watched the reactions of the residents of the shelter from afar. He decided to follow the girl's example and become a player. The solution was very simple. For only 100 experience points, the young man was able to change his appearance. After the transformation, his hair color and length changed, and he became taller and stronger. It was hard to recognize him now. Only a few facial features remained of the former Zhou Yuan. He was now a large young man with long silver hair. Lao Tz climbed out onto a large wooden box and asked who wanted to go into the dungeon with her. The guy put his hand on the surprised girl's shoulder and asked if he could join her group. Streamer turned to look at the handsome guy. She couldn't say a word, so Zhou Yuan repeated his question. Lao Tz embarrassedly muttered that he was very handsome. The young man smiled and asked the girl what happened to her. Streamer stared intently into the stranger's eyes. She assumed they had met somewhere before. Zhou Yuan recognized that they might have met somewhere. He suggested not wasting time and proceeding to clean up the dungeons. Someone from outside asked the protagonist and his girlfriend if they were a team. The guy turned around. Zhou Yuan noticed that 2 players approached them. They offered to divide the loot equally. The girl asked cheerfully to the main character, "Does he really want more people to join them?" Zhou cheerfully replied that he had no objections. The girl shouted cheerfully that the team was assembled and their goal was to clear the dungeon. The protagonist happily thought his girlfriend was a little dumb and didn't recognize him. A group of players approached a huge magical portal in the forest. The player said excitedly that the dungeon was too difficult. The guy replied annoyed that he would like to try it first. The girl excitedly told her companions, "The first team to clear the dungeon in this game will be Team Lao Jie." The girl saw the player come out and the system reported that Chao and was able to clear the dungeon for the first time. The girl was very much amazed and she couldn't believe that someone could go through the dungeon so quickly. Lao Ji turned to the side and said that it didn't matter at all that the first team was successful. She added that the game was very difficult. The main character looked at his girlfriend very carefully. He told her that her face was changing very quickly. Joe stopped the departing guy with his hand. Chow and asked grudgingly, "What happened?" The protagonist held out a small jar to his interlocutor. Joe told the guy to use this remedy. After that, the player chowed and happily thanked the protagonist for his help. The guy grudgingly asked the protagonist, why should they give their supplies to strangers? Joe replied to the guy that it shouldn't concern him what he does with his stuff. The player got very angry. The guy calmed him down and explained that he had only given him tea water. The girl shouted cheerfully that if everyone was ready, she would open the dungeon. The system informed the players that they would enter the dungeon into the zombie forest in 3 seconds. The girl and her companions got ready. The system informed them that they had to kill a low-level boss in 60 minutes. Lao Ji shouted admiringly that this game had a pleasant atmosphere. She looked around in surprise. Protagonist asked the girl, did she really know the creator of this idea? Lao Jie replied that she had taught the creator a lot. The player was scared. He shouted to his colleagues to look in front of him. The protagonist and his friends stood surrounded by huge green snakes. The ravenous and poisonous snakes all hissed and lunged at the players at once. Lao Ji cried out fearfully she was most afraid of snakes. She tried to close herself. The main character chopped up one snake and shouted to his friends to be careful. Joe shouted to the other players that the poisonous snake had very little blood. It can be killed with a single blow. The players grabbed their weapons and began chopping at the sides of the raptors around them. The frightened girl grabbed the snake and shouted that they were very horrible. Lao Ji shouted fearfully that she couldn't stand it and tore one of them apart. The girl screamed that she was very scared. The players saw the bodies of snakes all around them on Earth. The player cried out very frightened. The girlfriend asked him in surprise, what happened? Van shouted fearfully to his friends that he had been bitten by a snake. There were bite marks on his shoulder. The frightened and wounded player, kneeling, asked his friends to go away and leave him. The protagonist told his companion with a smile that the snake was not very poisonous and only needed to suck out the toxins. A friend came up to Vanya and said that although they had only recently met, he would help him. The player thanked his friend named Lou and said that he would remember his kindness all his life, after which the guy lounged over to his friend and sucked on his shoulder. The player shouted happily that he was very pleased. The protagonist and his companion looked on. It was hard for them to bear it. Lao Ji turned to the protagonist and asked that he step aside with her. Zhuo agreed with his girlfriend. The guy and his girlfriend went into the woods. Zhou asked the girl what she couldn't tell him. Lao Ji said excitedly to her friend that she too had been missed by a snake. The boyfriend excitedly shouted to the girl to suck out the poison as she might die in 5 minutes. The girl pointed her hand to her breast and said fearfully that she had been bitten here. The protagonist was embarrassed. He said that it would be difficult to suck the poison in such a place. Lao Jie said calmly that she felt nothing shameful, and it was all just a game. The protagonist drew close to his companion and told her excitedly that they might begin to. Lao Ji waited for her companion to suck the poison from her breast. She knew it was all a game, but it was very real to her. After the procedure, the protagonist smilingly thanked the girl for the treat. Lao Jie demanded from the guy to keep quiet, as she might lose her status. Van was very pleased. He thanked his friend named Lou and said that he would help him too if he needed it. The Lou player said a little shyly in response that he too had been bitten. Van very cheerfully told his friend that he would help him get rid of the poison. Lou started to take off his pants. He told his friend that his back was unprotected. The protagonist approached with his girlfriend and asked the companions in surprise what they were doing. Lao Ji told the sly friends that they could go on. Van sucked the poison from his friend's ass and shouted fearfully to his companions that it wasn't what they thought it was. The protagonist told the bathtub to stay away from him and that he didn't need any explanations. After that, the group of players traveled onward. They came to a dangerous green swamp. The girl looked around. She remembered that the dungeon was called the Zombie Forest, but so far they hadn't encountered any of them. The van guy told the joyful girl that even if zombies showed up, they would protect her. Lao Ji shouted displeased to her companions that she didn't want them to protect her. Suddenly there was some movement deep in the swamp. Someone was awakened there. A huge green demon jumped out of the swamp. The van guy was very scared and amazed. The swamp zombie attacked the player and bit his head. Van shook scared that his head was about to burst. The protagonist shouted to his companion to duck. He drew his sword. The guy swung his sword sharply to blow the zombie's head off. The protagonist was able to protect his companion Van and hooked the zombie's head with his sword. The zombie's severed head flew off to the side. Van shouted in surprise to the protagonist that he had struck very accurately. His blow came near the zombie's scalp. The protagonist said slyly to himself that he had missed a bit. The frightened girl shouted to her companions not to be distracted. They looked at the swamp. The players saw a huge number of green monsters begin to emerge from the swamp mire. The protagonist looked at the monster and realized that the zombie in front of him was only a level 1 zombie. He could have dealt with it alone. Player Van was very angry. He asked the zombies how dare they cripple his bald head. Then Van stripped off his clothes and shouted to the monsters that he would get even with them. The player pulled out a huge axe and asked the zombies if they were ready to take all his fury. The protagonist was surprised by the behavior of his companion. Guy Lu explained that Wang Xiaoming was a fitness trainer in ordinary life. For this reason, he quickly mastered the skill of muscle strengthening in the game. The dangerous green zombies started pouncing on Van from all sides. The axe player angrily asked the monster, "Does Thoth seek his own death?" After that, Van chopped off the green monster's head with a very rare and quick movement. Joe looked at his companion in surprise. He thought that one of the effects of the system was that players' taxes from real life could get inside the game. Van powerfully chopped his enemies with his axe and asked angrily who else wanted to attack him. Suddenly there was a very powerful explosion and Van felt a sudden drop in strength. All of the player's muscle mass suddenly disappeared and he became very weak and exhausted. Lao Ji asked amazed, "Why did the guy change so drastically?" Lu explained that Wang Xiaoming had a very low rating. For this reason, he could only maintain the skill for a short time. The protagonist shouted fearfully to the player not to use his abilities mindlessly. Joe received a system notification. He needed to destroy 10 swamp corpses at the same time and would receive new skills for doing so. At that time, green monsters came out of the swamp. They prepared to attack the players. Joe realized that it would be very difficult for him to attack 10 monsters at once. The main character shouted to his friends to climb a tree. He promised that he would deal with the monsters. Lu shouted fearfully that the zombies might climb the tree. The girl replied excitedly that she trusted the main character. At this time, a huge number of zombies swam across the swamps and prepared to attack. The protagonist bravely grabbed his sword. He was ready to strike down the monsters. Joe decided that his thunder sword would help him kill all the monsters in the pond. He activated the electric jamming skill. Then Joe lowered his weapon into the swamp. Immediately, electric sparks went everywhere. A powerful electrical discharge started hitting the zombies. They were all fried. A satisfied Joe told the swamp zombies that the electrotherapy had gone well. The system reported that the protagonist had won and received a skill in the form of muscle strengthening. The guy stood, and green corpses floated in the swamp. The girl was amazed that her companion was able to destroy so many monsters at once. Lu looked at the zombie's body and said that the protagonist straightened up with the help of the current. At that time, someone suddenly grabbed Laoji's leg with his hand from below. The tubby guy showed up. He held his companion by the leg and shouted for her to help him. The girl yanked her leg and shouted fearfully that there was another monster nearby. Van at this time dived into the swamp. The main character noticed that his girlfriend had just stepped on something. Lu said the girlfriend stepped on Wang Xiaoming. Laoji laughed evilly and said that the Wang was not different from the swamp monsters at all. Van smiled evilly and said that he was almost beaten to death by his own partners. The girl smiled and said she stepped lightly. Van angrily replied to her girlfriend that it wasn't a compliment. Laoji asked with interest to the player, why did he use such a dangerous ability? At this time, the protagonist noticed something off to the side. The system told players that it was time for the boss to appear and to get ready. Joe shouted to his friends to be careful as the boss of the depths was about to appear in front of them. Players saw a huge demonic monster. The system reported that the boss likes to eat living creatures. Van very bravely and determinedly decided to fight the boss immediately. The protagonist along with the girl shouted to the surprised player to stay away from the swamp. Wang asked his friends in surprise why he was not allowed to approach. Joe explained to the player that there are great side effects from using his abilities. He advised that the guy should fight from long distances. Van told his friend that they specialize in Middle Eastern combat. Lu replied that guns and ammunition are not readily available for newcomers. The protagonist told his companions cheerfully that he had nothing but pistols yet. Joe showed his friends the firearms at his place and said he had a lot of them. The players marveled at their friend's massive firearms arsenal. At the same time, the swamp monster moved towards the humans. Laoji started firing guns. She shouted to her friends to help her as she couldn't do it alone. The guys started shooting too. They shouted to their girlfriend that men shoot better. The protagonist looked at his colleagues. He realized that these guys could really be useful. Laoji shouted fearfully that the boss was not losing his life at all. Joe did not understand how such a thing could be possible. The girl reported that as soon as the points are reduced by the boss, they immediately start to regenerate again. This could be a game bug. At this time, the boss grabbed one of the monsters with his tentacles and pulled it to himself. After that, the boss ate Swamp Zombie's body and his energy was restored. Joe shouted that this boss was devouring zombies and thus replenishing his life supply. The girl asked fearfully, "Is there any point in fighting now?" Joe said that we should wait for the corpses to fully digest. The monster extended its tentacles towards the girl. The boss wanted to grab her. Lao Ji shouted loudly that she didn't want to be the fertilizer for the flower. At this time, Boss held her in his tentacles. The main character with his sword shouted to his girlfriend that he would save her. The other players confirmed that they would help as well. Lao Ji shouted fearfully to the guy and asked why he still hadn't saved her. Joe said confused that his abilities were still unavailable. Wang ran out of ammunition. The girl angrily shouted to her friends that she had to rely only on herself. Lao Ji then started shooting at the monster with her gun to hit it. The girl shouted to her friend that if she fell from a great height, she would surely die. The protagonist stretched out his arms and prepared to catch his girlfriend. Joe was able to dodge and catch his girlfriend who had fallen into his arms. The frightened girl saw the monster extend its tentacles towards her again. The protagonist swung his sword and began chopping down the swamp boss. The stricken monster began to hiss loudly. Green blood spurted from its wounds. The monster was screaming very menacingly and loudly. The players near them were scared. The boys covered their ears. Van yelled that he could hear a very loud sound. Lou said grudgingly that they couldn't stand up to the boss. Joe, standing with his sword, told his friends that his level was higher than theirs. Joe swung around and shouted he was beginning to use the electrical therapy technique. Joe slammed his sword into the ground with a swing and huge electric trails followed. Big lightning bolts reached the swamp demon. They hit him all over. The boy's efforts were not in vain. Thanks to his spell, the demon was defeated. Joe hid his sword in its scabbard. He told himself that it was only a second-level zombie. The zombie's body was lying on the ground. Electric sparks were running through it. The system informed the guy that his behavior had angered the boss. Now the demon had changed. The monster came to life again and raised its head. Van shouted happily to the main character that he would get more rewards for killing the boss, since he had changed. Lou now didn't believe that they could defeat the monster. Joe was surprised and disappointed. He knew that the boss had to be affected by the conductivity of the current. The Lao Ji girl explained that the grass reduced the effect of electricity, so the protagonist's attack was ineffective. Joe tapped his girlfriend unhappily and asked, "When did the advanced settings come out?" Then the evil demon started spewing green slime. The people were terrified. Joe got excited. He realized that the boss was able to increase his capabilities. The demon spit its slime right in the direction of the people standing next to it. The guy got excited. He realized that he would use his new weapon more. Joe shouted to his friends to be careful as the boss would have poisonous slime. The protagonist turned around and saw the two players completely bound by the slime. Then the guy heard his girlfriend screaming for him to save her. He turned around. Joe saw that there was a very large amount of green slime on the body of the girl he knew. Lao Jie grudgingly and fearfully shouted that she was very disgusted. Joe took off his clothes and told his girlfriend that he would help her. Lao Jie shouted to the guy to be more careful. Several huge chunks of green matter flew towards the protagonist. Joe swung around and with a very powerful sword strike, knocked back the slime that flew at him. The guy watched as the slime got on his hand. He realized it could kill his friends, at which time a guy from the side shouted happily what he had come up with. He turned around. The Lu guy explained that in his normal life he works as a chemistry teacher. He has an ability called chemical synthesis. Lu explained that because of his ability, he could combine the chemical properties of objects to create new ones. The guy showed the main character that he has gasoline and cloth. He can use his skill along with these items. Then Lou showed everyone the bottle and said he'd created a Molotov cocktail. The protagonist told his friend that he just put two objects together. He added that he could do that too. Joe swung around to throw the bottle. He shouted to the demon that there would now be torture by fire, after which the guy launched a burning bottle in the direction of the boss. Then the bottle hit the monster and completely set it on fire. Swamp Boss was all ablaze and began to die with loud screams. The system informed the protagonist and his companions that they had defeated the boss. They would all receive additional rewards. The protagonist shouted joyfully that now each of them would be able to pick up the rewards. The chests of rewards stood in front of the people. The system reported that Van had received a protein powder. The player shouted joyfully that he was going to be a real jock now. The Lu guy got an ironclad reward armor from the system. He wasn't very happy. The girl gained a special skill called Headshot. As a result, her strength increased to 300%. The protagonist opened his trunk to see what he had finally gotten. Joe saw in the chest that his reward lay there. He was surprised. The main character's friends were very surprised and amazed. There was a golden glitter coming out of the chest. Joe pulled an egg out of the chest. He was amazed. The system reported that someone was going to hatch from the egg. 3 days later, the protagonist was in the farm building with his friends. The system announced that new statuses would be added to the game starting today. There were many players standing on the lawn. The guy shouted happily that he would finally be able to get status. Another player said that now they would be evaluated just like Lao Jieza. The player was very surprised when he saw the girl. He asked her, how on earth can you level up early on? The companion shouted to the guy that he should start with a tree. She handed him the tools. The player took the instrument and said that the girl was definitely worthy of the title. The guys were tilling the land. One of them shouted that it would now be possible to buy new equipment. The girl informed the protagonist that the new people are working faster than the past ones. Joe cheerfully told the girl that the performance would only increase from here on. The girlfriend said there's an oversupply of labor now. The guy thought that if there was only one sanctuary, the players would get bored with it. New items would be needed. The protagonist asked the girl, can we use the bases near the New Moon headquarters? The girl replied that the bases are occupied by zombies. The girl explained to the guy that all the strongholds are located on the territory of the central settlements. To get the rights to operate them, you need to authorize yourself. After the crisis, the government lost its rights. Laws were constantly violated, and the territory was broken up under the administration of different villages. Control of the central settlement was divided among the major powers. The highest are called the shield bearers. Joe said that heroes have always existed in troubled times as well. If they continue to expand the territory, conflict will not be avoided. A girl came running in. She shouted excitedly that the central settlement had sent a team that had come to collect taxes. The guy said cheerfully that there would be no need to put anything off. He added that they would welcome the guests. The man said he was a tax inspector. He added that half of the produce would be taken as a monthly tax. The player grudgingly replied that when a pack of hungry wolves invaded the area, the tax collectors didn't care. Suddenly the man pulled out a gun and pointed it at the guy. He got ready to shoot. The tax inspector opened fire. He wanted to hit the player with his gun. The man got really scared. He noticed that someone started to defend the player. The Lu boy used his armor to protect his friend from a flying bullet. He told the man that he could not harm the resident of their New Moon shelter. A shell casing from his gun fell near the man. He stood and looked at the guy in front of him in surprise. The tax inspector angrily told the guy how on earth he could survive here, since he'd gotten into it. The player thanked his friend Lou and asked the latter anxiously if he was hurt. Lou pointed with a smile at his armored chest and said it helped him. Friends looked at their colleague Lou in amazement and said he was crazy. The main character came out with his girlfriends. He said hello to the man and asked him what he wanted. The taxman calmed down and told the guy that if he agreed to pay their taxes, he would do everything in his power to protect them. Zhou Yuan replied to the man that the place was previously overrun by a pack of hungry wolves. He added that the central district didn't help them in any way. The man replied to the protagonist that they were having some problems with the troops. He added that they could now provide people to help. Zhou told the tax inspector that he was simply bullying honest people. The man pointed the gun at the boy and commanded his subordinates to raise their rifles. Afterwards, the tax inspector told the interlocutors that if they evaded taxes, he would fire several bullets at them. The protagonist asked the man in surprise, does he really want to shoot? Then all of the main character's friends standing next to him drew their rifles and shotguns. The man asked the players in surprise, how on earth did they get so many weapons? The players cheerfully replied to the taxman that they get rewards and bonuses. The man shouted fearfully to his opponents that they were strong and prepared to run away. Zhuo pointed the gun at the man and said the man would not get away with it. The tax inspector got scared. He asked the guy in a trembling voice what the guy was going to do with his ass. The protagonist shot the man in the ass and he screamed loudly. The inspector kept running. The inspector angrily shouted to the boys that they were nothing but a crowd of hooligans. He was picked up and led away by the soldiers. The Laoji girl shouted angrily to her friends to move forward. The player loudly greeted the leader. The frightened girl with glasses suggested grouping with the central settlement for starters. The main character explained that the people who came to them were bloodsuckers, and therefore those people would never be satisfied. The girl said fearfully and excitedly. The newcomers showed themselves to be very brave. The protagonist looked at his friends and cheerfully thought that gamers in the game could be messy and evil, at which time the tax inspector arrived at the central settlement. The Fushi lad asked with surprise at the man, did the people of Midnight refuse to pay taxes and attack him? The inspector grudgingly told the guy that the players had trespassed on his ass and that meant him too. Fouchette looked happily at the tax inspector and said that he was telling the truth. A man with tears in his eyes said it was necessary to teach the boys a lesson they would never forget. The guy stood up and said that he wanted to see Zhou Yuan, but he doesn't want to go empty-handed. The man asked Mr. Fouchette fearfully what he wished for. The guy pointed his finger at the man's head and said cheerfully, not needing to go anywhere at all. Fushi told the tax inspector with a smile that the gift would be his head. Then a ravenous snake crawled out and slammed into the man's head. A few days later, a fair was being held at New Moon Asylum. Players were selling their stuff. A guy offered everyone a cracked shield with powerful defenses. Another player showed a blade that was so sharp it could pierce armor. The guys ended up fighting amongst themselves over a place to sell their stuff. The protagonist was watching the players closely through binoculars at the time. He told himself that the area of the shelter was increasing with the number of players. The system informed the protagonist that productivity in the shelter was down. Also, the mood of the people was down. Joe grudgingly said that because of the increase in the number of players and residents, he could not avoid trouble now. After which a car drove up to the estate at high speed. The players looked at the arriving humans with surprise and wariness. A girl got out of the car and with her came the Fushi manager. The girl was holding a box in her hands. She stood with the guy and looked at the players with surprise. The guy politely greeted the players and said that he wanted to meet Mr. Zhou Yuan. The players told Fushi very angrily that they were not happy to see him. Someone even grabbed a shovel. The guest said politely that he apologized for his subordinate offending the players. He asked the girl Tan Ai to show the players the box. The girl opened the box and there was a tax collector's head. The players were surprised to see the man's head. The girl said that Fushi could be a good man. The protagonist approached the guest and greeted him. He suggested going to the study and discussing. Fushi looked at his interlocutor and said that he had heard of his talent. After that, Fushi commanded the girl to guard the exit. Tan Ai replied that she would. The protagonist invited the arriving guest inside to his office. At this time, the players were looking at the girl at the entrance with great attention and interest. The players looked at Tian Ya with surprise. Lao Ji, looking at the girl, said that the NPCs are very well designed. Lao Ji then told the friends that if they were interested, they could go and have a conversation with the girl at the door. She added that if the friends were afraid, she would show them a master class. The guy fearfully grabbed Lao Ji's shoulder and told her not to mess with the arriving guest. Lao Ji confidently told her friends that she knew how to flirt with girls. Lao Ji then approached the guest and suggested that she go to her room while no one was there. I looked at my interlocutor and told her slyly that she should overpower her first. The guys were very surprised by the conversation between the girls. Someone admired very much the answer of the girl. The Lao Ji girl stretched her arms and said cheerfully to her rival that she would not keep her waiting. At this time, the protagonist, along with the guest who had arrived, were sitting in the study and examining the map. Joe asked his interlocutor why did he come to them now. Fushi told the protagonist that he was very interested in his shelter. He offered to buy the shelter from Joe for a large sum. He added that the protagonist would live like in paradise in a favorable neighborhood. The protagonist asked his interlocutor incredulously, "Is there really such a place left in this hell?" Fushi replied to the guy that for people like them, this place would be paradise. The protagonist imagined himself surrounded by riches and girls. Fushi told the guy that as long as he had power, the whole limitless world would be a paradise. Afterward, the guest told the protagonist to give him all the trouble. Joe thought for a while and told the guest that it was an attractive offer for him. After that, the protagonist looked sternly at the interlocutor and said that he was refusing. Fushi looked angrily at the protagonist and asked grudgingly, why did he reject his offer? Joe spread his hands apart and told his interlocutor that he simply loved freedom. The guest's snake essence began to activate. He said menacingly, he had already heard similar words to what Joe had just said to him. The protagonist offered his interlocutor a deal. Fushi calmed down a bit and asked his interlocutor what he wanted. Joe showed the map to his interlocutor and told him that there was a bandit organization called the Volcano Gang on the trade route that was causing him heavy losses. The guest explained that the group had seized the metallurgical plant. Several military expeditions were organized, but they were fruitless. The protagonist took out a knife and plunged it into the map on the table. Joe said that they would deal with the Volcano Gang. Thanks to this, the Fush caravan will be able to move along the paths. In return, the Fushi will no longer interfere with the protagonist and his settlement. The guest asked excitedly to his interlocutor what would happen if they failed. Joe promised his interlocutor that he would get the Hacienda Asylum. In any case, the guest would be in an advantageous position. Fushi looked at the documents and said he agreed to his terms. After signing, the deal will be officially concluded. After that, the guest turned around and headed for the exit. He said that he would wait for pleasant news from the protagonist. Joe said goodbye to his interlocutor. The protagonist heard a suspicious noise from the street. He turned around sharply. Joe jumped out into the street and noticed the girl Tianya standing there. There were beaten players lying on the ground. Fushi asked grudgingly to his companion what had happened. The girl replied calmly that they were simply playing. Fushi slyly told the protagonist that the skills of his subordinates were not good. He added that the protagonist and his friends would not be able to withstand the onslaught of the volcano gang. Joe replied to his guest that he and his friends were like a mob of stray dogs. If they wanted to live, they would break any bones. After which the guest and his girlfriend got into a car and drove off. Fushi asked the girl's opinion about rednecks. Chanai replied that she has not seen the strength of all players, so she can't say anything for sure. The warrior said she felt as if her opponents weren't afraid to die at all. The guy explained to his girlfriend that in the world, such people part with their lives the fastest. For this reason, he is confident that Zhou Yuan will lose. The boy jumped up joyfully and shouted that he was alive. His friend asked slyly if they were too reckless. The main character told his friends that a limited event called Defeat the Volcano Gang is starting in the game. All participants will receive a reward. Van asked the protagonist how the new mission was different from the dungeon. Joe explained to the player that he could kill enemies and get event points. There would be additional rewards after defeating 3 opponents. Suddenly, the Lao Ji girl broke away and ran towards the side. Her friends were surprised. Joe said he wasn't finished yet. He asked excitedly to his girlfriend, where did she run to? Lao Ji shouted menacingly to the players that whoever came first would get the top rewards. Joe pointed his finger in the direction and told his girlfriend that the volcano gang was quite the other side. The red-haired girl told the protagonist that she knew about his deal with the Fushi. She added that their rival faction was much stronger than the Hungry Wolves. The main character told the girl he was talking to that everything was going to be okay. The girl asked the guy, why is he so sure? Joe raised his finger up meaningfully and decided to tell his interlocutor something important. The protagonist explained to his girlfriend that their rivals would be like 4 natural disasters. One of the bandits made his way into the hut and demanded of the landlady that she pay him for protection. A woman fearfully begged the ringleader to let her go. She said she had some crystals. The ringleader slapped the woman's arm angrily, asking, does she really think they are some beggars? Then the thug opened the can and started pouring gasoline out of it. The bandit poured a can of gasoline on the little scared girl sitting there. The attacker then demanded that the woman tell him where she was hiding the jewelry. He threatened to kill her daughter. The woman dropped to her knees and screamed for the bandit to let her daughter go as they had no money. The intruder angrily shouted that the woman didn't want to tell the truth. He prepared to set the daughter on fire. The woman excitedly shouted at the bandit to stop, after which the bandit threw the lighter and shouted that the woman would be baptized by the volcano. The girl sitting in the cuddle with the toy begged and pleaded for her mother to help her. Suddenly someone grabbed a lighter that almost fell on the frightened girl. Joe lit the lighter and asked the bandit cheerfully, is he from the volcano gang? The intruder shouted to his opponent that they were about to fry the place. The girlfriend told the protagonist that they would each take 1 bandit. Lao Chi said she would take the cockhead. The bandit angrily asked the girl, how dare she mock his hair? The intruder turned on the flamethrower and yelled to the girl that he was going to burn her alive. Lao Ji shouted very loudly that she was very hot and in a lot of pain. The bandit shouted cheerfully that the girl would be baptized and burned to death. A surprised Joe reminded his girlfriend that she was a game character and shouldn't be hurt. The girl said cheerfully and with a smile that she didn't feel the burning anymore. The bandit asked in surprise, how could it be that the flames were useless against his rival? The girl turned towards the intruder and decided to attack him back. Lao Ji struck the nearby bandit with a flame strike. The intruder caught fire. He was thrashing around on the ground, screaming that he was hot. The burnt bandit asked the protagonist what he was going to do. He added that the volcano gang would not rest. The protagonist looked at his opponent with joy and said he wouldn't kill him, after which the protagonist and his friends took the bandit to a faraway abandoned hideout in the countryside. Joe and his colleagues scrutinized the detained attacker. The bound bandit frightenedly asked his interlocutors who they were and why they had taken him here. The protagonist told the bandit that all they wanted was information on the volcano gang. The bandit said excitedly that he would never hand over Mr. Vulcan. He added that he was not afraid of anything. The player then heated up a rebar and brought it to the bound bandit, Chow, and sternly asked the intruder, what does he think about this? The bandit said in a trembling voice that all the members of their gang had undergone the baptism of fire. He added that he was not afraid of being burned with an iron. The guy asked the bandit why he thought he was going to burn him. The guy told the bandit that he would put an iron in his ass. Chow and added that after a very high temperature, the intestines of the intruder would turn to mud. After that, the guy flashed his eyes and told the bandit it was time to give it a try. The intruder cried and said in a frightened voice that he would say anything. The player tossed the iron aside, said it came out easier than he thought. The guy turned to his friends and asked how they were feeling. The players replied that they were fine. The protagonist asked his friend, where did he learn to threaten gangsters like that? Chow and calmly replied that he had learned all his skills in Afghanistan. The protagonist looked at his friend and realized he couldn't pass up a shot like this. The bandit asked the players fearfully, Would they let him go if they got the information they needed? The protagonist told the bandit they'd let him go since they weren't demons. The bandit said their leader's name is Vulcan. His arson victims are only growing. Volcano leader has a major hobby, watching people burn. Lou said excitedly that the villain was very nasty. The Lao-Ji girl added that her hands were itchy. The protagonist asked the bandit if his leader had collected a lot of valuables. The captive said that the volcano must have a lot of gold. Cho asked the intruder, "Where's the gold hidden?" The bandit replied fearfully that no one had ever been able to find the treasure of the volcano. The protagonist said dreamily that he could smell gold. Joe shouted joyfully that he would definitely make a fortune this time. Chowan demanded that the prisoner tell about the armed gangs of the volcano. The bandit said that there are about 100 people in the group. Each of them has a Molotov cocktail and a flamethrower. The prisoner said that the gang's territory is surrounded by Minami. Therefore, it is almost impossible to attack from the front. Chowan told the protagonist that if they couldn't attack from the outside, they would try to get inside. The main character told his friend that he could take them with him when he came back. Joe said that after joining the gang, not everyone would be able to endure the baptism of the volcano. The bandit asked fearfully, "What is the baptism of the volcano?" The protagonist explained that during the baptism of the volcano, a bright fire burns the hand. If the candidate can endure, he enters. Players were discouraged by the information about such a baptismal ritual. Lee said that a serious person could not be frightened by it. Bandit, looking at his companions, said fearfully that they were monsters. After that, the protagonist along with his companions arrived at the location of the Vulcan gang. Around the base was full of bodies on crosses. Joe and his friends told the ringleader that they wanted to join them. Vulcan sat masked on his metal throne. He asked the guests if they knew the terms of entry. Joe said cheerfully that for the sake of the volcano, they were even willing to burn out their own lives. Lao-Ji cheerfully supported her friend. The ringleader looked carefully at the men who had come and asked who would be the first to start. The protagonist realized the hand and said cheerfully that he wanted to be the first to pass the test. Joe looked at the ringleader and told the latter confidently that he wanted to prove his sincerity. One of the gangsters with a flamethrower told the protagonist menacingly that not everyone can take baptism out of the gang, after which the bandit pointed his flamethrower at the protagonist and yelled that he was going to burn. The protagonist stood perfectly still while the bandit shot him with a flamethrower. Joe thought to himself absolutely calmly that he wasn't hot at all. The protagonist's hand was burning. He said calmly that he imagined the ritual of baptizing the volcano to be completely different. The bandit angrily shouted to the protagonist that he would use double the firepower. Joe shouted back calmly that he could feel everything. He continued to burn. The bandit shouted that if Joe didn't ask for mercy, his hand would be burned to the ground. The main character said in a calm hum that he felt a cool feeling. Players were amazed because of their friend experiencing the pleasure of being baptized by a volcano. The protagonist raised his hand up and said cheerfully that there was no damage on him. His girlfriend came up to him. Lao-Ji reminded the protagonist that he had reduced his pain sensations. She added that it was now her turn. The girl told the bandit that she was willing to endure anything to get into the Vulcan gang. The bandit pointed the flamethrower at the girl and told her that her friend had done well and to keep up. Lao-Ji plopped down on the ground and screamed that she was in pain. She could only be healed by the leader's strength. The ringleader ordered the subordinate to put out the girl and the next candidate approached for the test. Lao-Ji stepped aside. She asked joyfully to the protagonist, "Did she play well?" Joe said unhappily to the girlfriend that she was overdoing it. Chowan said that the protagonist and girlfriend both overdid it, after which the guy confidently held out his hand and said it was okay to start. The bandit with the flamethrower asked surprised at the guests, "Is there anyone normal among them?" Then the bandit pointed the flamethrower at Chow's arm. The boy held firm. He was the last of the candidates. The ringleader told his interlocutors that all three of them had passed the test. From now on, they would be members of the Vulcan gang. The main character told his friend that he played it really cool. The girl said that Chowan could get her Oscar. Chowan explained that he didn't turn off the pain. That's why he was able to get a good result. A volcano mentor named Shan Wen appeared. He added that he had a new task for the players. Joe thought that they should take this kind of chance to complete a task. After that, the three of them would be appreciated in the gang. The Lao-Jie girl took out her sword and told mentor Shan Wenyu that they would do whatever was necessary. The protagonist looked at his girlfriend and decided she was really fast. Chang's mentor told the players that they need to capture a cargo truck that was sent from the central settlement. There is something important inside the truck. The protagonist told his mentor that the three of them might not be enough for such a task. The mentor said that the elite from the gang will go along with the players. Sean added that the cargo is very important and cannot be missed. Joe replied confidently that they would not let their leader and mentor down. The protagonist, along with his friends, left the building where the Vulcan gang was located. The girl cheerfully said that everything had gone very smoothly. She decided that everyone was impressed by her acting skills. Chow and said excitedly that it wasn't that simple. The protagonist replied to his friend that they could now take appropriate measures. Suddenly, some glass jar fell out of the protagonist's pocket. Laoji lifted the jar with surprise and asked, "What is this?" The main character was embarrassed. He wanted to explain to his girlfriend what it was he was missing. Laoji said she saw Zhou rubbing the remedy from the jar while taking a bath. The main character said grudgingly that his girlfriend was peeking at him while he was washing up. The girl replied indignantly to her friend that she was just passing by. Zhou held out a jar to his girlfriend and said, "Inside is sunscreen." Laoji asked suspiciously, "Why would a game character apply such a cream?" The protagonist explained to his girlfriend that the cream helps improve attributes. Laoji asked her friend to give her the remedy too. Zhou shyly said that he couldn't give the cream as it was a very valuable item. The guy thought to himself that the jar contains fireproof cream. It helps him to exchange system points. The main character doesn't have a dead body, so he can't control the level of pain he receives the way the morning players do. He had to use a special cream to pass the volcano test. A red-haired bandit appeared. He congratulated the protagonist and his friends on their successful ordeal. He said his name was Hogo. Zhou asked his interlocutor what he wanted to advise him. Hogo told the boy cheerfully that he was impressed with the courage with which he had passed the volcano test. He added that now they would get along. Zhou replied calmly to the bandit that he would further endeavor for the good of the volcano. Hogo told the protagonist that the car was ready and he could go on the mission. The protagonist, accompanied by his friends and gangsters, set off in cars on a mission. The departing fighters were watched from the roof of the building. The Vulcan leader told the mentor that the new guys might be spies sent by the Fushi. The mentor slyly replied that he too had some suspicions. For this reason, he sent the protagonist to rob a load of Fushi. Sean would watch carefully to see if there would be anything suspicious in the behavior of their new gang members. The ringleader menacingly said that if the guests dared to deceive him, he would torture them to death by fire. The protagonist and his companions stopped at a staging post in the wasteland. The Hogo bandit ordered 4 cups of bullseye noodles for himself and his companions. Hogo said with a smile to his new acquaintances that he had picked up such a dish for them as well. The main character, along with the other players, told the Hogo to eat by themselves, and they are not hungry. The boy began happily nibbling on his food. He told me that a caravan from the settlements was bringing supplies through this prairie. Their target should be about to approach. The protagonist said fearfully that the shipment would arrive with a security escort. If there was a firefight, they would lose their advantage. Hogo has ordered that the road be lined with mines. When the caravan passes by, it will explode immediately. As a result, the bandits will be able to attack suddenly. Chow took the mine in his hands and was immediately able to figure out all of its characteristics. The bandit was very surprised that the guy could realize everything very quickly, just by looking at the mine. Hogo shouted excitedly to his companions to hide as the caravan was approaching. Joe saw a vehicle approaching. He asked his friend, "What is the armor of this vehicle reinforced with?" At which time suddenly a little boy ran out with a ball right in front of the truck. The woman angrily shouted at the boy named Xiao Feng to come back. The boy looked fearfully at the car coming at him and called out loudly to his mother. At that time, the Laoji girl came running up. She threw herself on the ground with the boy. The truck braked and hit a food stall. The car stopped near the tables where people were sitting. The owner of the stall was very upset that his point of sale had been damaged. An angry driver jumped out of the car. He shouted unhappily that the boy might have muddied his car. Laoji asked grudgingly to the guests, "Do they know the rules before arriving at the settlement?" The driver said his name was Ning Tai, and he obeyed Fouché. He added that it was no big deal if he took a few insignificant lives. Laoji was very angry when she heard such words from Ning Ti. She cursed the bandit. The bandit drew his gun and told the interlocutor that if she was brave, let her talk to the bullet in his gun. The protagonist told the bandit that his girlfriend was a bit feeble-minded. He added that he would cover tonight's food expenses. Laoji was unhappy because of what her friend called his girlfriend. Zhou whispered to her companion not to aggravate the situation. Ninti told his interlocutors that he forgave them today. He shouted to his underlings that they could have enough to eat today. The bandits were very pleased with this instruction from their leader. At this time, Zhou asked the player if everything was ready. Chow and replied that everything was ready. Ninta raised his glass and told everyone to fill up. He added that Mr. Fushi would reward them later. The protagonist looked happily at his tablemates. He prepared to attack them a little later. Suddenly, someone came from behind and put a hand on the protagonist's shoulder. Zhou asked Commander Ning in a calm voice, What happened? The bandit tells the protagonist that he can't protect his girlfriend, so he has to stay home to keep his face. Joe told Commander Ning with a smile that he advised him to keep his head down. The ringleader ordered his underlings to get into the car. He added that they were leaving, and then the truck with the gunman inside went on its way. The protagonist contacted his associates. He informed them that the target would be arriving in a couple minutes. An armored truck was driving through the desert. Suddenly, the driver inside felt sick. The driver told the commander in a trembling voice that he had something wrong with his stomach. Ningti grudgingly told a subordinate that he ate a lot. Then the truck hit the mine. The driver didn't see it on the road. There was a very large explosion and the car was thrown sideways. After the explosion, the armored car was lying on its side. There was smoke all around. The ringleader opened the hatch and climbed out of the truck. He asked grudgingly, who dared to attack them? The protagonist emerged from the dust clouds. He asked the bandit with interest if he had forgotten him. At this time, the protagonist was approached by his accomplices. Joe told the commander Nin that they had eaten and could go on their way. The bandit angrily asked the players if they knew who their leader was. Joe replied that the leader of the criminals was Fushi. He added that he would keep the criminals alive if they handed over the goods. Ningti menacingly asked his interlocutor if he knew what kind of goods they were carrying now. Joe said cheerfully, the bandits carrying luxury goods, cigarettes, or alcohol. He told his accomplices to get ready to fight, after which the perpetrators drew their weapons and prepared for a gunfight. The Hogo bandit was frightened. He didn't understand how their opponents had so much firepower. The guy looked closely and noticed that various weapons had fallen out of the truck. Joe said grudgingly to the bandits that arms smuggling is a serious crime. The ringleader Ningti drew his gun and started shooting. He shouted at his rivals that they didn't value their lives. The main character fell to the ground. He shouted to his friends to hide. Joe peeked out from behind cover and shouted to the Hogo bandit to hurry up and run and hide. The Hogo maniacally doused himself with gasoline and said it was time to show their faith. The bandits doused themselves with gasoline and shouted that they were doing it for the glory of the volcano gang. Hogo set himself on fire and shouted to those around him that he was in the embrace of the flames. The bandits caught fire and rushed fearlessly against their rivals. He yelled to his associates that they needed to finish off the crazies running at them. The burning bandits ran at their opponents without any fear. Hogo put his arm around one of the fighters. The fighter shouted fearfully that he was hot. The ringleader, still firing, shouted to his subordinates that they couldn't even defend themselves. Suddenly, the leader of the bandits felt sick. He screamed that he had a stomachache. The protagonist thought happily that his plan had worked. He started heading towards the ringleader. Joe raised a huge stone above his head. He activated his skill. Then the protagonist threw a huge rock at his opponent. Ninda, lying on the ground, said in a pained voice that the protagonist had put something in his food. Joe drew a huge sword. He shouted to his opponent that all means are good in war. The ringleader quickly pulled out a gun and shouted to the protagonist that guns can be faster than swords. The bandit opened fire. The protagonist deflected all the bullets with his sword. Joe waved his sword and shouted to his opponent that the gun could only be faster within 7 paces. And then the protagonist swung his sword upwards. The flying sword knocked the pistol out of the hand of the leader of Ninte. He could not understand how this had happened. The protagonist at this time caught the gun flying at him. He shouted to his opponent that this was the limit of 7 steps. Joe pointed the gun at the head of the leader of Ninte and immediately fired. The protagonist looked at his slain opponent and said the gun was faster and more accurate. Around the wrecked truck lay a huge number of burning corpses of various bandits. Chow said that all the members of the volcano gang were dead. He added that if they returned the weapons to the volcano gang, they would gain their trust. The girl took the weapon in her hands. She said grudgingly that she didn't want to give all this good for nothing to the Vulcan gang. The main character said that their goal is to destroy the Vulcan gang. If they give up all their weapons, they'll help them. The Chow guy said that there was only one method, how to take away the weapons and not attract the attention of the volcano gang. The protagonist said joyfully that now they were leaving together with Brother Chow. Chow then said that he could increase their advantage. The girl asked impatiently to her interlocutor, what method was he talking about? Chow presented the gun in his head and told his friends that he relied on theirs. And then the guy pulled the trigger and a shot rang out. After the shot, blood splattered on the protagonist and his girlfriend. The main character, along with his girlfriend, brought the dead bodies of the militants to the location of the volcano gang. Joe shouted that his friend Chow died. He said the enemy's firepower was very strong. All the members of the Vulcan gang were killed. Chow sacrificed himself to cover them. The leader said that the mission was a test for the newcomers. Thanks to the fact that the boy and the girl had returned, they would now be in the main gang. Joe bowed to the ringleader and said that he would do his best to make the gang prosper. To himself, the protagonist thought happily that he had succeeded. While in the woods, a girl was shooting zombies with a gun herself. The girl grudgingly said that there was no news about where the main character had gone. At this time, a huge monster suddenly appeared behind the girl. The warrior turned around and started firing her pistol. She didn't understand where a level 2 corpse was coming from here. Suddenly, the demon swung around and hit the girl with all his might. The girl raised herself on the ground. She prepared to shoot the monster with the gun. A stranger with a weapon suddenly appeared and prepared to strike the demon with an axe from above. The girl swung around and struck the dangerous monster with her weapon. The girl sitting on the ground asked, surprised at the stranger, who was she? The girl said with a smile that her name was Sujo King and she was a player. Then both girls decided to go swimming in the river. They threw their clothes on the bank. Sujo King stood in the river and washed off the green slime. She said the game was very realistic. After that, the red-haired girl came up behind her new acquaintance and grabbed her breasts. The girl cheerfully and slyly said that even the touches were real. Sue laughed merrily. Suddenly, the girl's bathing suit flew off to the side. She got embarrassed. The girl dove deep into the water to catch her swimsuit. Sujo King swam out of the water and shouted joyfully that she had caught. Suddenly, the girl was very much frightened and excited. She looked at the shore. Joe was very surprised when he saw the girl Sujo King in the water. The girl Sue angrily and hatefully shouted at the protagonist that he was a pervert. The main character shouted to the frightened student not to be frightened. He said his name was Zhou Yuan. After that, the guy activated the transformation process. He became young again. Joe told his interlocutor that now she should believe him. Sue was very surprised. She couldn't believe that Zhou Yuan was standing in front of her. Suddenly, a red-haired girl quietly came up behind her. She grabbed a stick, and then the girl smacked the protagonist over the head with a stick. Both girls looked at the guy with astonishment. Sue happily said that the protagonist had woken up. Joe opened his eyes and looked at his girlfriend. He said he saw his late grandmother calling him to the other side of the bridge. The girl shyly said she bumped the guy as she thought she had come across a pervert. The protagonist looked at his girlfriend and said he definitely wouldn't have attacked her if he was a pervert. The angry girlfriend grabbed the guy and demanded that he repeat what he had said earlier. Joe jumped to his feet and told his interlocutor that there was no time to waste, and they needed to get back. There was a mass gathering at the New Moon shelter. People didn't understand what had happened. The main character popped up on the stage. There was a map. Joe shouted to the interlocutors that they had gotten a map of the Volcano Gang's territory. The guy pointed with his hand to a row of rifles. He added that they bought a lot of guns at a good price. Van said fearfully that they had fewer players than the Vulcan Gang. He added that they wouldn't succeed if they attacked without a plan. The protagonist told the interviewer that he would give each player who participated 3 resurrection attempts. Joe reported that killing an ordinary member of the Volcano Gang would yield 100 points. There would be a reward of 1,000 points for the boss. There were many eager warriors at once. Players grabbed weapons. The girl Sue very excitedly told the protagonist that she too wanted to register. The protagonist told the cheerful interlocutor that she'd better stay out of the battle. Sue approached the boyfriend and said she had advanced gaming skills. Joe told the girlfriend she could go. The girl winked at the protagonist and promised that she wouldn't reveal his little secret. The protagonist pulled out a gun and fired a shot into the air. He yelled for the players to follow him. The fighters raised their weapons and shouted that they would outbid the Vulcan Gang. The next day, the leader of the Vulcan Gang gave out gold bars as a reward to his underlings. The protagonist and his girlfriend thanked the Vulcan ringleader. A guy comes in. He yells to the leader that there's a group of men on the outskirts of the city who want to attack them. The mentor told the boy that there are a lot of booby traps around. Uninvited guests are bound to fall into them. The interlocutor fearfully replied that the enemy fighters had successfully passed the traps without casualties. The mentor became very agitated. He turned around and looked closely at the protagonist and his girlfriend, after which the preceptor pointed at his interlocutors and shouted that they were traitors. The girl angrily asked her mentor, "Did he really just notice that?" Thereupon the Lao Ji girl pointed her finger at herself and threateningly said that she was a traitor. After that, the girl pointed her finger at the ringleader and shouted angrily for him to repent. The girl drew her weapon and fired in the direction of the Vulcan ringleader. The protagonist threw himself to protect the ringleader sitting on the throne with his body. Joe shot his girlfriend in flight and shouted, "She's a traitor." The bullet hit the girl and wounded her. She fell to the floor. There was a bloody stain on her body. Lao Ji shouted to the guy that she would pursue him even after death. The girl rolled over dead on the ground. Before she died, she said her companions would not stop, after which the protagonist walked up and shot the girl in the back with a gun. Joe angrily told the dying girl that she was acting out a lot of drama. The main character said that he didn't expect his girlfriend to turn out to be a traitor. Joe added that he will go into battle right now to finish off his enemies and prove his loyalty. The leader put his hand on the boy's shoulder and told him that he was a great fighter. He advised that the protagonist should heal his wounds first. at which time the servants brought out a huge stone hammer for their leader. The Vulcan reached out his hand and grabbed the huge hammer from the servants' hands. The ringleader swung his hammer and shouted to his subordinates to follow him. The mentor told the ringleader that someone else might be involved. He advised him to think it over more carefully. The ringleader grabbed his subordinate by his clothes and asked, "Did the man really want to teach him?" Vulcan then threw his mentor to the floor and shouted angrily that they were leaving. The mentor said thoughtfully that there was a conspiracy. He added that when the leader returned, they would see who was right. Joe told Mentor that if the ringleader won, he would survive. If Vulcan came back defeated, he would kill Sean. The man asked with surprise and fear at the protagonist, "Why does the man think that?" Joe replied to Man that the leader is very arrogant. If he comes back in a bad mood after losing, he will kill Sean. The mentor agreed with the words of the protagonist. He asked what should he do. Joe suggested that the man split up all the treasures the ringleader has and then run away. A group of fighters with weapons stood across from each other and prepared to fight. The Vulcan shouted to his subordinates that he would give 3 crystals for each enemy killed. After that, the fighters dispersed and started beating each other with various weapons. The sous vide girl struck her opponent with a sweeping, powerful arm strike. The girl said happily to herself that the game is very realistic and very bloody insides. Suddenly, Sue felt a very strong blow from behind. Someone stabbed her with a sword. One of the bandits stabbed the girl with his weapon and told her cheerfully that the ambush attack had been successful. Suddenly, the fighter was very surprised. He noticed as the girl began to pass into herself. The astonished bandits noticed that the murdered Sioux girl had begun to resurrect. The fighters looked at the revived girl and couldn't understand how she was able to come back, at which time the guy chowed and started firing his pistols at the opponents. Lao Jie's girlfriend also ran up and started shooting at the bandits with her weapon. The bandit was very much surprised. He remembered that Chiao and together with the girl Lao Ji had died exactly earlier. The other fighter shouted that the creatures in front of them were unkillable. Chief Vulcan intervened. He pounded the floor with a flaming hammer with all his might. Vulcan swung his hammer in all directions and prepared to strike his opponents. The protagonist, together with his mentor, stood near a huge safe. The man said that in this place the volcano had collected all the gold. The mentor said excitedly to the protagonist that even he didn't know the code to the safe. Joe told his interlocutor that he had a key. The man asked with surprise as a guy, "Can there be a key if the safe has a code lock?" The main character took an explosive out of his pocket and said his key was called C. Then the guy attached his explosives to the safe door and activated the timer. There was a deafening and powerful explosion. The door was completely destroyed. The man shouted happily as they entered. The protagonist thought they saw gold. The protagonist looked carefully in front of him and saw that there was nothing inside the safe. Joe angrily grabbed his mentor and asked where did the gold go. Shang answered fearfully that he didn't know. After a brief pause, the mentor reported that Vulcan had spoken of how he had hidden the treasure in a safe place where no one could find it. The protagonist looked around. He guessed what kind of security the leader was talking about. The mentor saw the protagonist walk over to the chair where Vulcan was sitting. He asked fearfully to the boy what he wanted to do. Joe took out his knife and said that the volcano keeps its gold here. The protagonist began to break apart the metal paneling of the chair. Inside was a golden sheen. Joe began to shout joyfully that the gold had been found. The mentor was also overjoyed. After that, Chan pulled out a gun and told his opponent that there wasn't enough gold for 2. Suddenly, a very powerful shot knocked the man aside. He was badly wounded. The wounded mentor was lying on the floor. He looked angrily at the protagonist. Joe stood with a rifle in his hands. He told the man that he had started the ruckus very early. There was a bloody battle going on outside. Bodies of soldiers were lying around. The Vulcan leader swung his hammer to strike another opponent. A huge hammer in the hands of the ringleader knocked another opponent to the ground. The fighter was knocked aside by the blow. Vulcan shouted at his opponent to crumble to dust. The battered girl said fearfully that Wang Xiaoming would not rise again. She asked Qiao Yi, "Can he be resurrected?" Qiao replied to the girl that he too would not be able to come back to life again. He added that with their current weapons, they would not be able to deal with the head. Lao Qi angrily shouted that they would have to surrender. The gang leader spread his arms to the side and shouted that no one could stand against the awakened one. Then someone threw the severed head of the mentor at the feet of the ringleader. Joe told the ringleader that his advisor named Zhang Wen wanted to hand him over, but he finished him off. Vulcan stared in surprise at the head lying beside him. The protagonist was sitting on a golden throne. He shouted to the ringleader that it was his turn. The volcano was very angry. He shouted that the boy had betrayed him and touched his gold. The leader promised that there would be no mercy for the boy. Joe drew his sword. He said he was a secret agent and it's not considered treason. After that, the guy accelerated with sword in hand and shouted that he would use his new technique. The protagonist shoved himself forcefully off the ground and soared high into the air. Joe swung his sword in flight. There were blue electric sparks all around him. The protagonist then swung his sword at the hammer in the ringleader's hands. After a tremendous blow, electric sparks passed from the sword to the hammer. The ringleader's entire body was shot with electrical sparks. He started to fall to the ground. The burned mask of the volcano fell off of him and flew off to the side. It was all cracked. The protagonist looked at his opponent in surprise and said he saw his face. A player shouted fearfully that he was leaving. The ringleader had tongues of flame in place of his head. Another guy yelled that the volcano was clearly not human. Vulcan smiled evilly. He was surprised that his opponents called him human. The ringleader shouted that he was not a low-level creature. Then he told people to watch what would happen next. The fire had completely engulfed the body of the volcano. Metal shielding sheets began to bounce off of it. The burning headman shouted to his rivals that this was evolution. The players were very scared. They couldn't understand what they were seeing. The fire continued to rage. The volcano leader's body was very hot all around. The protagonist fearfully said that if a volcano can command flames, it must be awakened. The ringleader smiled evilly and said that he was the most successful project awakened and with the highest form of evolution. He added that humans were the lowest. Vulcan shouted very angrily to his rivals that they were about to turn to dust. The Laoki girl said fearfully, "The damage from this ability will be great. It will be a fatal blow." The protagonist replied to his girlfriend to calm down, as killing the volcano would not be easy. There were huge clouds of flame around the leader. He shouted that his flames were invincible. The volcano blazed brightly and glared angrily at the people standing nearby. The protagonist calmly replied to the ringleader that he was the one stoking the flames. Joe started walking calmly in the direction of the volcano. He told his opponent that even his grandmother's fire pit was hotter. The protagonist used a fireproof cream to prevent the heat from affecting his body. The boy happily thought to himself that he was protected because he had applied the fireproof cream beforehand. The blazing volcano shouted angrily that the real hellhole would begin now. After that, the leader turned into a huge burning dragon. He decided to attack the protagonist. The protagonist drew his sword and prepared to fight against the burning dragon. The fire monster flew around the guy and prepared to strike him. Joe began to swing his sword in all directions to strike his opponent. Vulcan summoned a dragon to devour his enemy. He stood opposite the protagonist. The protagonist swung his sword and tried to chop the ringleader with it. Joe looked at Vulcan with hope and joy and thought he had succeeded. The ringleader looked at the guy with a wicked smile and said that his body had already become part of the elements. The Vulcan swung his hot fist and shouted, "Normal attacks won't work." The ringleader pounded his rival and shouted that he couldn't kill him. The guy flew off to the side. The protagonist flew towards the wall after a powerful blow. He couldn't defend himself. He crashed at high speed into the golden throne standing near the wall. Vulcan began to stride toward the protagonist. He said something about the fiery realm of the dead. Joe, sitting on the throne, noticed that the gold had begun to melt. He could no longer stand up. The protagonist sat motionless on a golden throne. He was soldered to it without moving. The volcano smiled evilly and told the protagonist that he couldn't burn him, but he could try to chain him to the throne. Joe looked cheerfully at his opponent and said that the latter wouldn't be able to use the gold. The protagonist has activated the skill. Eventually, the gold should be converted into system points. The golden throne around the guy started melting. The system said he was getting points for it. The frightened Vulcan dropped to his knees. He angrily demanded of his rival that he return his gold. Joe grinned at the ringleader and said that he now knew how to kill him. The guy swung his sword and said that he would spend a lot of points on the highest degree of ice elemental. The blazing volcano shouted angrily to the protagonist that it would burn him to the ground. The burning body of the ringleader split into two huge flaming dragons. An ice ball appeared in the protagonist's hands. He asked the volcano with interest. Did the volcano decide to defeat him? The protagonist launched one ice stream and it froze one burning dragon. The remaining single burning dragon shattered into several pieces. Burning volcano, standing on Earth, looked at the ice dragon and didn't understand how this could have happened. The icy dragon began to crack and gradually fall apart. The dragon's body shattered into small pieces of ice and scattered around. The volcano leader's body was completely frozen. It too began to crack. Eventually the volcano shattered into small ice shards and scattered around. The players were very happy to win. They put their hands up and shouted that they had an awesome leader. Joe told his friends in a very haggard voice that this was not easy for him. The main character could hardly stand on his feet. He started to fall to the ground and said it was a hard battle, after which the guy collapsed completely exhausted into a full-blown faint. 2 days later, in the New Moon shelter, Joe lay unconscious. On the bed beside him were the girls. The girl looked at the guy lying on the bed and said that it had been 2 days and he still hadn't woken up yet. Lao Ji smiled evilly and said that there was only one way to awaken the protagonist. The girlfriend asked what was the way. Lao Ji grabbed the knife and cheerfully said, "You can finish off Joe and wait for him to come back to life." Sue got worried. She asked her friend fearfully, "Is it okay to do that?" The girl bitch came right up to her friend and said, "You can't do that." Lao Ji looked at her friend in surprise and said her breasts were bigger than hers. The girl suggested to the interlocutor to take off her clothes to check completely. At this time, the main character woke up. He opened his eyes. Joe lifted himself up on his bed. He noticed Lao Ji holding his girlfriend's breasts from behind. The main character smiled quietly and wished the girls good morning. He waved at them. The girl with glasses informed the guy that they had captured the volcano gang and took the materials they needed. She asked excitedly, what was wrong with Joe's face? The protagonist had hand marks on his face. Joe asked the interviewer if she had sent anyone to the central settlement. The girl reported that she had temporarily soldiered on spreading the word that the Vulcan gang had been defeated. She added that Fushi would not turn down good booty. Joe said that it was necessary to recycle the Vulcan arsenal before Fushi would rebel. The interlocutor said that 2 adventurers had gone missing in recent days. No information had been received from them. At this time, players Van and Lou were sitting next to each other, tied up in some dungeon. The players noticed that someone was coming in. They started shouting excitedly to be let go. An angry, red-haired girl appeared in front of the guys. She told the interlocutors that they were very brave for opposing the final evolution. Van excitedly told the girl that she was a new non-game character. Lou called the stranger a sister villain. The girl took the whip and said her name was Tian Xuan, and she was a member of the final evolution. She demanded that the guy tell everything they knew. She promised that they would suffer. Then Tian Xuan slapped the guys' faces with the whip. Wang almost screamed. The girl angrily asked the players how they felt when they were hurt. Van excitedly shouted that the new non-game character was awesome. Lou shouted that he really liked being hit by a girl. The girl looked at the players sitting in front of her with surprise. She couldn't understand why they were laughing, though they felt a lot of pain. Van said cheerfully to his friend that these were their fake bodies, so the pain wouldn't last long. Lou replied admiringly that in this game, non-game characters are very cool. The girl told her interlocutors that their consciousness is displaced. That is why they feel pain. Tian put her hands on the players' heads. Lou said that he felt very strange. Wang had a bad feeling. The girl activated her powers on the heads of the players. Lightning flashed. The Lou guy screamed really hard. He felt something going on in his head. Joyful Tian said that thanks to the 2 players, she would be able to reach New Moon Asylum. At New Moon Asylum, 2 girls were walking on the lawn. One of them said she'd bought a new outfit. The girlfriend looked around excitedly and said she'd see if there were any cute guys here. When footsteps sounded, 2 guys were heading towards the girls. The girl was frightened. She asked the approaching strangers, "Did something really happen?" The girl held out her hand for the van. She examined it and said that it was unfortunately not suitable for her. The woman told the guy she didn't like it and to get out of the way. Suddenly the van shouted menacingly. Then the guy jumped on the girl and wanted to bite her with his teeth. The interviewee asked fearfully, "What is he doing?" The girl fought off the van and screamed at him to let her go. At that time, the guy came up to the other girl. A frightened, red-haired girl was running away and screaming that the 2 guys were crazy. The protagonist was doing calculations on a calculator. He realized that thanks to the Golden Throne, he would get hundreds of thousands of points. Joe did the math and thought happily to himself that he would make decent progress. The door opened and a frightened girl ran in. She called out to the main character. The interlocutor informed the guy that the players on the street began to turn into zombies. Joe was very surprised and worried. Joe went outside and was very scared. Zombies were running around and munching on people. The protagonist noticed his girlfriend Lao Ji rushed at him and turned into a zombie. Joe grabbed his girlfriend by the shoulder. He asked the system, could the zombie player be infected with the virus? The protagonist turned to the side and looked at the message. The system told him that the virus was penetrating the player's mind. It was driving him insane, gradually eating away at his brain. In the real world, everyone in the game started fainting. They were struck down by an unknown virus. The guy in the virtual reality helmet slumped to the floor and started shuffling from side to side. Inside the cafe, computer players began to feel the effects of the virus as well. The guy was really scared. He didn't know what was going on around him. The girl saw the clients lying unconscious on the table. She shouted for an ambulance. The TV announcer reported that hundreds of cases of acute coma have been reported in the city. All patients are unconscious. The main character was very annoyed. He banged his hand on the wall with all his might. Joe didn't know what to do now. He remembered the system reports that once a virus entered the brain, a person would stop moving. Joe asked with interest, "Can this 100 people be saved?" The system reported that the players could be saved by transferring their real bodies to this world. It would help bring consciousness back into the body. The guy was determined. He asked the system, should we make the players truly be in this world? The system explained that it would take a lot of points to save players, and it wouldn't give any bonuses. Joe explained that he had invited gamers into the game. No one else was responsible for anything that happened. The system reported that a tally was in progress. A message popped up that such an action would cost 120,000 points for the guy. The system recommended not to accept such an assignment. Joe responded to the system that he did not heed its recommendation. The protagonist held out his finger to the confirmation button and said he accepts everything. The system registered the choice the protagonist made. It wrote off his points. System reported that it is foolish to think as if humanity relies on logic. Joe smiled to himself and said that this is where the greatness of humanity is manifested. The system informed the protagonist that 120,000 points had been spent, and the move was beginning. The doctor stood in front of the patient lying on the bed. They noticed his body glowing. A woman asked her colleague with surprise what had happened. The man replied that all of this was beyond the scope of medicine. The reclining gameress on the bed also began to glow with a bluish light. The guy sitting on the chair glowed blue before teleporting. After that, the guy's body disappeared and his virtual helmet fell to the floor from a height. The gamer's body completely disappeared from the chair. Only his jacket remained on the floor. The news reported that the patients who were in comas have completely disappeared. No cause has been identified. The system informed the protagonist that all players had been moved. The virus was cured, and the goal was achieved. The protagonist thought sadly to himself that now he had the hardest part. The next day on the estate, human bodies began to come to life. The girl woke up. She didn't remember what happened. The guys couldn't understand what had happened to them. The main character came out and told everyone there that he had some very sad news for them. Joe told surprised gamers that they got into the game for real. The Lao-Ji girl asked the protagonist with surprise, have they not been in the game before? Joe told his friends that people could no longer return to the real world and could not be resurrected. The players started taking turns trying to get out of the game, and they couldn't. One of the girls put a gun to her head and said that if her character died, she could go back to the real world. Joe rushed to the girl and fearfully told her not to do that. The girl didn't take advice and shot herself in the head with a gun. The players surrounded the body of the girl lying there. They noticed that she had neither disappeared nor resurrected. Someone with hatred threw a rock at the protagonist's head. Joe didn't have time to dodge it. The players started throwing rocks and eggs at the guy. They demanded that he let them out of the game. Joe shouted excitedly that he, as the Asylum Lord, would find a method to have the players leave the game. The Lao-Ji girl sharply raised her hand up and said that she believed the protagonist. The girl told her friends that if they continued to rage, nothing would change. Together, they could overcome the attack. Qiao said that nothing in the world is impossible. Instead of complaining, one should find a method to strengthen one's own strength. People were talking amongst themselves. One of the girls said that there was no other way out. Gamers began excitedly asking the protagonist if he was giving assurances of their safety. Someone asked what would happen if zombies invaded their hideout. Joe told the players that he had prepared a defense while they were unconscious. The main character turned to the side and shouted for someone to come out and protect them. Someone's very heavy footsteps sounded. Huge green monsters appeared from the side. The monsters were very big. They started to approach and retreat the gamers. The people were very frightened. They didn't realize what these monsters were all around them. The green monsters all approached the protagonist as one and bowed to him. Joe explained that he had created zombie guards. He used zombie remains and large crystals to do so. These monsters would now guard the sanctuary. The gamers looked at the green monsters and decided that they could protect them. The protagonist turned his hand to the side and commanded menacingly for the zombies to be released. A huge mob of bloodthirsty zombies came from outside. They headed for the humans. The player fearfully shouted to his friends to stay away from the zombie. One of the green monsters pounced and started beating up the zombies. He took them down with one punch. Joe stood surrounded by monsters. He said cheerfully that he would definitely protect everyone. Night descended on the estate. The borders were secure and there were zombie guards. The Lao-Chi girl was relaxing. She was drinking wine straight from the bottle. The girl was very intoxicated. She sat on the roof of the house and looked in front of her. The main character came over and told her girlfriend that she's very optimistic if she's here drinking. Lao-Ji smiled and said that one should always go forward. You can't solve a problem with tears. Zhao thanked the girl for supporting him. He added that he would buy her a drink. Lao-Ji took the bottle and said cheerfully that they could get drunk. Here and now all worries put off for tomorrow. The protagonist bumped bottles with his girlfriend and offered to get her drunk. The guy and his date drank all night. They left a lot of bottles behind. The protagonist slept on his bed in his house the next day. A knock on the door was heard. The girl yelled for Joe to get up. She added that she wanted to come in. The main character stood up on the bed and rubbed his eyes. He felt that his lower back was hurting. A red-headed girl came running in. She yelled to the guy that something important had happened. The girl asked the guy fearfully and shyly, "Why isn't he dressed?" Joe started to get dressed. He answered the girl that he likes to sleep naked. He asked why she was making noise. The woman said that Fushi had come here. The guest wanted to talk to the protagonist about the terms of distribution of rewards for defeating the volcano gang. The protagonist was already fully dressed. He said that he also wanted to negotiate terms with Fushi. The arriving guest was sitting at the table. His guard was standing next to him. The guard grudgingly told her master that she had already been standing there for half an hour. The protagonist explained to his guest that he had a lot to do as well. The girl asked the protagonist very angrily how dare he dare to be rude to her. Fushi asked Joe if he had heard that the volcano had blocked their way when they were ferrying. Joe replied calmly that the volcano gang no longer existed. There was only the second New Moon Sanctuary. Fushi told his interlocutor that he should give the war plant to the central settlement. The protagonist grudgingly replied that Mr. Fushi wanted to take away the war factory, which had come to them very hard. The guest's hand turned into a dangerous snake. He asked the boy, did the man refuse his request? Joe told his guest that wishing alone would not be enough. He added that he needed to offer something in return. Fushi calmed down. He asked his interlocutor what he wanted from him. The protagonist pointed his finger at the girl and said that he wanted his bodyguard from Fushi. The guard angrily and grudgingly asked the protagonist, what does he have to say? Joe asked his interlocutor to give him the girl. In return, he promised to think about the offer. Fushi slyly asked the protagonist, does he really want to swap the plant for a girl? The guard excitedly asked her master, does he really agree? Fushi told the girl Tanai not to worry. He reminded her that she was willing to sacrifice herself for his well-being. The main character laughed and said he was only joking. He doesn't need a new girlfriend from Fushi. The guest was very displeased. He jumped up abruptly. Fushi said threateningly that someone had come along with him. The protagonist showed the guest to the exit door. Joe asked Fushi who he was talking about. The protagonist and his guest went outside. There were dead bodies of militants lying around. Fushi was very surprised and angry as his elite army was completely defeated. Joe said groggily in response to his companion that he too belonged to the elite. The protagonist told his rival not to fast on the asylum of the new moon. Joe smashed the door with a powerful blow and said that the Fushi army had just lost. Fushi asked the boy, is he really going to turn against him? Joe replied, not everything in this world is decided by fists. After that, the disgruntled guest turned around and started walking away with his guard. The girl asked the protagonist why they let them go so easily. The girl asked the protagonist, why did they let them go so easily? Joe explained that Fushi is the leader of the central settlement. It is not profitable to kill him. After that, Fushi and his girlfriend arrived at the building in the central settlement. The system reported that the eye shell authorization was successful and the door opened. The guard asked her master in surprise, what is in this place? The guy explained that every person has a limit. Joe only opposed him because he has the protection of zombie bodyguards. Fushi walked over to a huge remote and started tapping something on the keys there. The guy pressed a big button and said the main character guessed he started doing special research. Inside a large room, a capsule opened. Green slime spurted out. A huge monster emerged from the open capsule. It screamed menacingly. The monster jumped out of the capsule and prepared to attack the people standing nearby. The commander shouted to the soldiers to attack. The soldiers opened fire. The bullets from the gun flew towards the monster. They had no effect on it. The brown zombie ran at the humans and prepared to attack them at a breakneck pace. The monster was calmly tearing the people standing next to it apart with its hands. After the zombie had killed all the humans, he screamed menacingly. There were torn bodies lying around. Girl Tan, I said, scared that zombie was able to kill an entire squad. Fushi angrily said that this is the secret weapon he wants to create. The blood guy screamed that he wanted to create a peerless army of zombies. Fushi laughed evilly and said that the protagonist's hideout would take the first strike. At this time, huge brown zombies continued to ripen in the pods. There was a bluish, dangerous slime around the brown zombie's body in the capsule. A week later, the protagonist practiced fighting at his estate. He swung his sword. Suddenly, someone approached the guy and asked if his name was Zhou Yuan. A group of guys asked him to take them in. Their leader informed them that their house had been turned into the resident evil. The protagonist asked the guests from the central settlement, what did they have going on? A guy with tears in his eyes said that a mass infection of the zombie virus had begun in their settlement. A couple days ago, two guys were walking in an alley. No one was around. A friend hugged his drinking buddy and said a few glasses of liquor caused him to start shedding tears. The guy asked his friend, "Why isn't he singing?" while a monster came up behind them. The guy was very surprised. He turned around and noticed Monster grabbing his friend. The zombie began devouring the young man right in front of his buddy. The guy started running away very quickly to the side and calling for security to help him. The young man was very frightened. He could not understand how it could have happened. Huge brown zombies running around the city, killing everyone in their path. The guy, frightened, told the protagonist that they had managed to escape from the central settlement. There might still be survivors there. Joe asked the guest, so why didn't he approach their leader, Fushi, to deal with the monsters? The interlocutors said fearfully that it was because of the Fushi that the zombie virus had appeared in the central settlement. The frightened guest said that Fushi was currently locked in his fortress and was not interested in the lives of other people. The guy got down on his knees in front of the protagonist and asked him to help him. He added that his wife and child remained in the settlement. People got down on their knees to beg the protagonist for help. Joe looked at the guests who came and told them that he was neither a hero nor a good man. The protagonist spread his arms to the sides and said cheerfully that he would not abandon people to their fate. The next day, the protagonist was holding a settlement meeting. He was standing on a stage. Joe told the people that he wanted to form a team and go to the central settlement to protect the innocent and deal with the zombies. He asked who would like to join. The players weren't in a hurry to support their leader. The guys realized they could die. Joe told his interlocutors that they were carrying the same burden. If the central settlement fell, sooner or later the zombies would reach their new moon sanctuary as well. A red-haired girl suddenly ran out and told the main character that she wanted to join. Joe reminded her interlocutor that she was not a player and asked why she wanted to support him. The girl said it was better to start fighting now than to sit around and wait to die. The armed Sue and Lao Ji girls came running up. They too shouted in unison that he was joining them. Chowan said he was joining too, but demanded double the reward for the mission. The girl with the bomb in her hands said they were taking the bad guys. The players started shouting in a friendly way that they too all agreed to join, and they would make it together. The protagonist was very emotional. He looked joyfully at the players. The girl walked over and slyly asked the protagonist, "Is he really crying?" Joe said with tears in his eyes that he is a very strong man but shows softness. District of the central settlement was blocked by a huge metal door. The green zombies grabbed a huge wooden ogle and prepared to use it. The zombies accelerated amicably and smashed through the metal door with a wooden ogle. The protagonist rubbed his hands together impatiently and said it was time to begin. People were running through the streets of the city trying to escape the huge zombies. There was panic all around. A frightened girl ran up to the wall. A monster was coming at her. The girl screamed and was terrified. Startled, the girl closed her eyes and screamed for someone to help her. Suddenly, there was a gunshot from outside. The zombie's bullet went through its head and blew its brains out. The frightened girl asked in a trembling voice to the strangers, "Who were they?" Lao Ji slipped her hand through and told her interlocutor cheerfully that they had come to save her. A girl was chopping zombies with an axe. She yelled to save others. Her girlfriend yelled for people to rely on them. Van found a wounded guy lying on earth. He yelled out to help the others. Lou found a survivor. The main character came to the doors of the lab. He decided to open them with an explosion. Joe hooked a large time bomb to the door. The bomb exploded and the huge metal door shattered into pieces. Joe looked carefully into the large hole in the wall. He needed to find the leader named Fushi. The main character said cheerfully that the zombies came from this place. Fushi may be hiding here. Girlfriend told the guy that the other players were busy with a rescue mission. She was the only one who could come to his rescue. Joe put his hand on the girl's shoulder and said that she should go back to the others. If something happened, he wouldn't be able to help her. Lao Ji replied to her friend that she knew he would bring it up. The conversationalist told the guy that he was obligated to come back. Everyone is waiting for him to get them out of this world. Joe replied that he hadn't forgotten about his promise. The protagonist found the entrance to the lab. He opened it with a kick. The guy was walking around the lab. Everything was trashed. There were no people around. Suddenly, some zombie girl lunged sideways at the protagonist. The monster girl swung around to strike the protagonist with her claws. The guy managed to dodge. The main character was surprised. He looked at the girl and realized that she was familiar to him. Joe looked closer, frightened, and realized that in front of him was a former Fushi bodyguard who had turned into a zombie. A zombie with an evil look accelerated and lunged at the protagonist. The protagonist drew his weapon and began to fight off the bodyguard. Joe was barely holding back the zombie girl's attack with his sword. The protagonist was surprised to think to himself that the girl was also infected. He thought it was Fushi's fault. Joe swung his sword and shouted to his opponent that he could not allow her to block his path. The protagonist activated a skill called Thunder Beheader of the Ninth Blade. The bodyguard was hit with a very strong electric shock. She screamed. After a powerful electrical pulse, the zombie girl fell to the ground. The protagonist looked at his sword. He told his rival that he had helped her. The bodyguard asked in a weak voice, "How did the guy help her?" Joe told the interlocutor that she was not fully infected. "Now we have to wait a little longer." The protagonist activated a vaccine in the system called Stopping. Joe took out a syringe and prepared to inject it into the girl's leg. He told the interviewee that it was up to her whether she could be cured. The bodyguard passed into herself, and her appearance became human again. She asked apprehensively what had happened. Joe pressed his interlocutor against him and said that she should repay him for saving her life. The bodyguard looked at the guy gratefully and said she didn't expect him to save her. The girl handed the protagonist a green syringe and told him to hide it. Joe asked her what it was. The girl explained that the green substance called G7527 is a potion. Fushi uses this drug to create zombies. The companion said with consternation that the master had created a test subject out of her. She was able to steal some of the potion before she passed out. Joe held the syringe in his hand. He asked his interlocutor if he would turn into a zombie after this potion. The bodyguard said the protagonist should be able to withstand the drug. Joe said with a smile that Fushi is a common snake. He added that he would taste the snake chowder today. Then the girl grabbed a knife and prepared to stab herself with it. The protagonist asked the bodyguard apprehensively what she wanted to do. The girl closed her eyes and shouted that people like her were not worthy to live on this earth. The protagonist intercepted the knife with his hand. He shouted to the girl to wait. The guy cut himself and blood started dripping out of his hand. There were drops on the floor. The interviewee tearfully asked the guy why he was stopping her. Joe explained to the girl that he had saved her and her life now belonged to him. He added that he would not let her die. The protagonist turned around and started to walk away. The girl yelled that she would wait for his return. Joe was walking through the lab. There were broken capsules all around. None of the people were there. The protagonist paced and found the location of the lab's main control panel. Fushi was sitting by the console. He didn't turn around, but he realized that the guy had found him. Fushi was watching a video of zombies eating people. The protagonist grabbed his sword. He said that the people believed in Fushi, but he had turned their lives into hell. A rival started turning into a snake. He said that he had studied zombie viruses and discovered that the human body had a limit. The guy completely turned into a snake. He yelled that he didn't want to be human. The protagonist activated his special skill to make his sword stronger. Joe swung around and chopped off the snake's human head with a very strong blow. The severed head rolled across the floor. The protagonist walked over and picked it up. The guy looked at the severed head and asked with surprise, was his opponent really weak? Suddenly the severed head came to life and began to hiss loudly and predatorily. The boy was frightened. The snakehead slithered into the guy and bit him in the shoulder. Joe cried out fearfully. Many snakeheads began to grow out of the former man's body. One of the heads screamed that the main character had gotten to the top of the food chain. One of the green predators lunged at the protagonist. Joe decided to activate the spear from the snake's mouth. The guy was startled to feel his body not moving after the bite. Suddenly, a Lao-Ji girl ran up from the side. She cut the snake very quickly. The protagonist was startled when he asked his girlfriend what she was doing here. The girl was holding part of a severed snake. Lao-Ji turned around to the guy and said she couldn't help herself and followed him. The snakeheads angrily told the people that their lives would be cut short at this point. The protagonist held the girl in his arms and once again activated his skill called Snake Mouth Spear. And then the snakeheads started flying off like severed heads. Suddenly, the head serpent noticed something that scared him very much. The protagonist grabbed a syringe of green serum and prepared to inject himself. The protagonist grew a huge and powerful arm. He shouted to the snake that he would kill it. The serpent asked the protagonist with surprise, where did the protagonist get his G7527 development from? The protagonist at this time used his huge arm to prepare to grab the monster. Joe grabbed the green snake with his hand and prepared to strangle it. Then the guy ripped one of the snake's heads off in a powerful motion. The monster got more heads. He yelled angrily to the guy that he couldn't kill him. He added that he was the highest form of evolution. After that, all the snake heads simultaneously started attacking the guy with green slime. The protagonist raised his arm and used it to shield himself from the green slime flying at him. The green slime really hit the guy hard and made him feel very heavy. The serpent angrily told his rival that he wanted to devour him. Joe would become part of him. Then the huge predator opened its mouth to swallow the guy. The serpent grabbed the man with its mouth and swallowed him completely inside itself. Joe was inside the serpent's throat. He was still alive, but he couldn't move anywhere. The protagonist decided to activate his skills to escape from the serpent's innards. The monster shouted menacingly that great power was growing in his body, and now he was the best. Suddenly, the huge serpent felt as if something was gripping in his stomach, at which time a huge hand burst from the snake's belly. The monster was frightened. The serpent watched as his insides fell out of him. The monster couldn't understand how he could lose to an inferior creature. The main character reached out and grabbed the serpent by the head. He yelled that the monster must be devoured. The snake didn't have the strength to run or fight back. The guy's hand got really big. The serpent cried out menacingly that he disagreed and resisted. He made attempts to break free. The guy's hand got really big and he couldn't control it anymore. The claws on the guy's hand were big and it got really huge. Joe shouted to himself fearfully, his strength spiraling out of control. The guy injected himself with a potion. He activated the freeze and essence concentration. After that, the protagonist's arm started to shrink a little. He felt lighter. The exhausted guy collapsed on the floor. He told himself it was over for him. A couple days later, the main character woke up in a hospital bed. He was bandaged up. The protagonist was lying bandaged on the bed. He began to slowly regain consciousness. His girlfriends were standing around the guy. The girls were glad he was awake. Joe got up and sat on the bed. He asked excitedly to the girls, "How are things going?" The red-haired girl reported with a smile that after the main character eliminated the Fouché, they were able to deal with the zombies. The interlocutor said that the work on the reconstruction of settlements is currently underway. The main character went out on the balcony. People were happy that he was awake and they all greeted him. Joe sadly said that his girlfriend Giezi sacrificed herself to save him. He added that he didn't even know her name. Suddenly the guy felt someone kick his slipper from behind. A Lauchi girl in hospital pajamas came up. She grudgingly told the guy that he had already buried her. The protagonist turned around and was surprised to see that his girlfriend was alive. The girl grudgingly reminded the guy that they wanted a drink. After it was over, she wanted to tell her friend her real name.